Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of furniture sliding across hardwood floors. My first thought was that I was dreaming, but the scraping noise came again, followed by a soft thud. Someone was in my bedroom, moving things in the dark. I lay completely still in my bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart pounding against my ribs. The divorce had left me paranoid, jumping at every noise in this small rental house. But this was different. This was real. Another scrape. The dresser was shifting position, but I couldn't see anyone moving it. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, almost solid. My breath caught in my throat as I watched a black mass slide across the wall like ink spreading through water. The house on Cedar Street wasn't my first choice. After Sarah got the main house in the settlement, I needed something cheap and quick. The rental agent mentioned previous tenants breaking their leases early, but I was desperate. Now 3 weeks in, I understood why no one stayed long. The first week, things would be slightly out of place when I got home from work. I blamed it on stress and poor memory. The second week, I started hearing footsteps at night, but found no signs of break-ins. By the third week, I was taking photos of how I left rooms, proving to myself that things were moving. Now I watched as dark figures, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, methodically rearranged my bedroom. They had no definite shape, just deeper patches of shadow that absorbed what little light came through the windows. The temperature dropped so low I could see my breath. My muscles tensed as one of the shadow figures drifted past my bed. It moved my nightstand 3 inches to the left, adjusting it with precise movements. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't respond. The shadow beings didn't acknowledge me. They worked with silent purpose, as if following some incomprehensible blueprint. The largest concentration of shadows gathered around my wardrobe, an old piece that came with the house. The landlord insisted it stay, claiming it was too heavy to move. The shadows seemed drawn to it, swirling around its base like water circling a drain. My fingers gripped the sheets as I watched them open the wardrobe doors. The hinges didn't squeak. They never did, even though they looked ancient and rusted. The shadows reached inside, their forms stretching and distorting as they manipulated something I couldn't see. Time lost meaning. I lay there for what felt like hours, watching them work. Eventually, the shadows retreated, seeping into the corners and under the furniture, until the room returned to its normal level of darkness. Only then did my paralysis break. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice. The screen showed 4:43 a.m. I turned on every light in the house and sat in the kitchen, downing coffee until sunrise, trying to convince myself it had been a nightmare. But when I returned to my bedroom, everything had shifted. The dresser was 2 feet closer to the door. The nightstand had moved. Even my bed had rotated slightly. I threw open the wardrobe doors and my stomach dropped. The inside walls were covered in deep scratches, crossing and overlapping in chaotic patterns. They weren't fresh. The wood had darkened around the marks with age. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough edges. No tool I owned could make marks like these. They were too deep, too irregular, and some were in places impossible to reach without dismantling the wardrobe. I spent that day at work going through the motions, barely functional from lack of sleep. My co-workers noticed something was off, but I brushed away their concerns. How could I explain what I'd seen? I couldn't even explain it to myself. That evening, I did something I'd been avoiding since the divorce. I called Sarah. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice guarded. "What do you want, James?" "I need to ask you something weird," I said, pacing my living room. "When we were house hunting 2 years ago, do you remember looking at a place on Cedar Street?" The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "We never finished the walkthrough," she finally said. "You don't remember? We got to the master bedroom and you had a panic attack. Said something felt wrong. We left right after." I stopped pacing. I don't remember that. You were strange for days afterward. Kept talking about shadows moving when no one was casting them. Her voice softened slightly. Are you living there now? Yeah. My throat felt tight. Things are happening. I'm not crazy, Sarah. I'm seeing... Get out! She cut me off. I don't care if you have to break the lease. Just get out of that house. I hung up and sat on my couch, staring at the wardrobe visible through my bedroom doorway. The scratches inside suddenly seemed more sinister. What if they weren't made by something trying to get out, but by something trying to get in? I called the rental agent next. After some pressure, she admitted the house's history. No tenant had stayed longer than 2 months in the past 5 years. Most broke their leases within weeks, citing personal reasons. One family left all their furniture behind, only taking clothes and essential documents. I searched online for the house's history, going back decades. The original owner died in 1947, leaving it to his son. The son sold it 6 months later for well below market value. Since then, it had changed hands 37 times. The listing photos showed different furniture in every shot except for one constant, the wardrobe. That night I set up my phone to record the bedroom. I took 2 sleeping pills and crashed on the couch, leaving every light in the house blazing. I woke to darkness. Every bulb had burned out simultaneously. The recording showed 3 hours of normal footage, then static. When the image cleared, my bedroom furniture had rearranged itself, while the video was corrupted. The wardrobe doors stood open, darkness pooling impossibly deep inside. I called in sick to work and drove to the county records office. The clerk helped me trace the wardrobe's origins through property records and bills of sale. It predated the house by at least 50 years, first appearing in an estate sale after a local carpenter's death in 1893. The carpenter's journal was preserved in the Historical Society's archives. His final entry is described in a commissioned piece for a wealthy client, a wardrobe made from wood taken from an ancient tree struck by lightning. He wrote about strange phenomena while working on it: tools going missing, scratches appearing overnight, shadows moving against the light. The last entry was a warning. It wants to be filled. God help me, I can hear them scratching to get through. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. The shadows weren't just moving furniture, they were searching for something. The wardrobe wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a door. That night, I decided to face it head-on. I positioned a chair facing the wardrobe and waited, armed with only a flashlight. The shadows came at their usual time, seeping out of the corners like ink stains spreading. They ignored me again, going about their usual pattern of minute furniture adjustments. I forced myself to stand, legs shaking, and approach the wardrobe. The shadows swirled around me, cold spots brushing against my skin. I yanked open the wardrobe doors. The scratches had multiplied, forming patterns I hadn't noticed before. They weren't random. They were words in a language I didn't recognize, repeating over and over. The shadows poured into the wardrobe, and in their movement I finally understood. They weren't searching. They were measuring. Each furniture adjustment, each precise movement, they were calculating distances, angles, positions. The wardrobe wasn't just a door, it was a frame, and they were aligning everything in the room to focus on it, like a lens focusing light. I slammed the doors shut and backed away. The shadows retreated, but I felt their attention on me for the first time. They knew I knew. I spent the next day researching movers and storage facilities. I had to get rid of the wardrobe, break whatever pattern the shadows were creating. But when I called to schedule a pickup, the landlord's number was disconnected. The rental office had no record of my lease, despite the signed papers in my filing cabinet. That night, the shadows came earlier. They didn't bother with the furniture. They gathered around the wardrobe immediately, their forms more solid than ever. The doors swung open on their own, and the darkness inside wasn't the absence of light, it was something alive reaching out. I ran. I didn't bother packing, didn't stop to grab anything. I got in my car and drove until sunrise, checking the rearview mirror for shadows that weren't there. When I finally got the courage to return a week later with police, the house was empty. Not just of my belongings. Everything was gone, including the wardrobe. The rental agent claimed the house had been vacant for months. My lease paperwork had turned to blank pages. Sometimes I drive past the house at night. New tenants move in every few months. Through their windows, I can see the wardrobe, waiting in their bedroom. The shadows are still measuring, still calculating, still preparing for something. I wonder how many other houses have these shadows. How many other rooms are being subtly adjusted day by day, creating a pattern too large for us to see? And what happens when they finally get everything in the right position? I live in a studio apartment now. No bedroom, no wardrobe, nowhere for shadows to gather. But sometimes late at night I catch movement in the corners of my vision, and I swear the furniture isn't quite where I left it. Yesterday, I found a scratch on my closet wall. Deep, irregular, impossible to make with any tool I own. I'm moving out tomorrow. Some doors aren't meant to be opened and some patterns are better left uncompleted, but I know they'll find me eventually. The shadows are patient, and they have all the time in the world to get their measurements right. I first saw it during my evening run through Oakwood Heights. That was my mistake, running so late. But after working overtime at the office and sitting in traffic for 90 minutes, I needed to clear my head. The October air was cold enough to burn my lungs, and the streetlights cast long shadows between the cookie-cutter houses of our suburb. Back then, I still thought shadows were the worst things lurking in our neighborhood. My breath came out in white puffs as I jogged past the Murphy's house at 9:47 p.m. I remember checking my watch because I'd promised Sarah I'd be home by 10. We had been fighting about my late-night runs. "It's not safe," she'd say. "You'll get mugged or hit by a car." I always laughed it off. Muggers and cars weren't what I needed to worry about. The impact of my running shoes on concrete echoed off garage doors and vinyl siding. Most houses were dark except for porch lights and the blue flicker of TVs through living room windows. I was pushing my usual pace, trying to finish my 3-mile loop before Sarah started texting. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, fast and light. Too fast. I glanced back, expecting to see another runner. The street was empty, but the footsteps continued, moving through the yards parallel to me. Whatever it was running between houses, cutting across lawns in the darkness. The steps were wrong. Too quick, like someone hitting drum pedals at triple speed. No human legs could move that fast. My tired brain tried to rationalize it. Probably kids messing around. Or maybe my own footsteps echoing off the houses weird. I picked up my pace anyway, my heart rate spiking above its usual zone. The rapid footsteps kept pace, moving through the yards to my right. They'd fade as whatever it was passed behind houses, then come back louder in the gaps between. When I reached the intersection of Maple and Oak, the footsteps suddenly stopped. I paused, hands on my knees, sucking in the cold air. Nothing but normal suburban night sounds. Distant traffic, someone's TV, the hum of heating units. I straightened up and stretched my calves, feeling stupid for getting spooked. Too many horror movies and too little sleep. I finished my run without incident, got home by 10:02. Sarah was already in bed, pretending to be asleep. I took a hot shower, trying to wash away the work stress and the weird feeling from those footsteps. By the time I crawled into bed, I had convinced myself it was all in my head. Dehydration and exhaustion playing tricks on me. At 2:17 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. I remember the time because I checked my phone, squinting at the bright screen. Sarah was actually asleep now, her breathing slow and steady. I slid out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her. Our master bathroom was being renovated, so I had to use the hall bathroom next to my home office. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the heating system. The hallway carpet muffled my bare feet as I shuffled toward the bathroom. I didn't bother turning on lights. I knew the layout well enough to navigate by the dim glow coming through the windows. I was washing my hands when I heard it again. That impossible rapid-fire stepping sound moving across our backyard. My hands froze under the faucet. The footsteps were clearer now, sharper. They crossed the yard in less than a second, then stopped at the back of the house. right outside the bathroom window. The window was covered by cheap plastic blinds that came with the house. They glowed faintly from the neighbor's security light. As I stood there, dripping water onto the counter, a shadow passed across the blinds. Not a normal shadow. It moved too quickly, like a film running at double speed. Then the footsteps started again, circling the house. 20 steps in the time it should take for 2 or 3. My body switched to autopilot. I turned off the faucet slowly, trying not to make any noise. My wet hands shook as I reached for the bathroom door handle. The footsteps completed their circuit of the house and returned to the bathroom window. The shadow passed over the blinds again, longer this time. Like whatever was out there had stopped to look in. I eased the bathroom door open, wincing at the faint creak of hinges. The footsteps instantly shifted to the side of the house, moving toward the front. I padded down the hallway as quietly as I could, heading for the master bedroom. Behind me, the steps reached the front yard. A sharp tap on the living room window made me freeze. Then another, and another. Something was knocking on the glass with rapid mechanical precision. Tap, 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 like a woodpecker on cocaine. I forced myself to turn around. Through the archway separating the hallway from the living room, I could see our front windows. The blinds were open, showing the dark street beyond. As I watched, a figure sprinted past. It moved so fast it was just a dark blur. But its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin. Its arms and legs pumped at an impossible rate. The tapping stopped. The thing ran back the other way, somehow even faster. It left after images in my vision, like when you wave a sparkler too quickly. My ears started ringing, either from fear or from some subsonic frequency the creature's movement generated. I backpedaled toward the bedroom. The thing kept running back and forth in front of our house, each pass faster than the last. The air took on a static charge. My arm hair stood up. The ringing in my ears built to a painful pitch. Just before I reached the bedroom door, the creature stopped directly in front of our living room window. Even with its unnatural speed, it halted instantly, no deceleration. One moment a blur, the next perfectly still. Every muscle in my body locked up. It stood at least 8 feet tall. Its limbs were too long, jointed in too many places. Its skin was pale gray and seemed to ripple, like heat waves off hot pavement. But its face. I still have nightmares about its face. It didn't have one. Just smooth, blank flesh where features should be. Yet I felt it looking at me, studying me. My hand found the bedroom doorknob behind me. The creature's head tilted at an angle that would snap a human neck. Then it smiled. Its blank face split open horizontally, revealing rows of needle teeth that wrapped all the way around its head. I threw myself through the bedroom door and slammed it shut. Sarah sat up in bed, startled awake. "What's wrong?" she asked. Before I could answer, the rapid footsteps started again. They circled the house at blinding speed, tapping every window as they passed. Sarah's eyes went wide as the taps reached our bedroom window. The blinds clattered against the glass. "Under the bed," I whispered. "Now." Sarah didn't argue. We squeezed underneath just as the tapping stopped. The bedroom window rattled in its frame. Something pressed against the glass, blocking the faint light from outside. I could hear a sound like sandpaper on wood, the creature's skin moving against our house's siding. Sarah gripped my arm so hard it hurt. I put my other hand over her mouth, afraid she might scream. We lay there in the dark, hardly breathing, as the thing outside tried to find a way in. Minutes passed like hours. The pressure on the window increased. The glass creaked. I remembered reading somewhere that standard residential windows can withstand about 37 pounds per square inch of pressure. The glass bowed inward as the creature pushed harder. Just when I thought the window would shatter, the pressure disappeared. The rapid footsteps resumed, moving away from our house. They crossed the street, cut through the neighbors' yards, and faded into the distance. But we stayed under the bed until dawn, afraid to move. When sunlight finally filled the room, we crawled out. The window was intact, but the frame was warped. Deep scratches marked the exterior siding. Sarah called in sick to work. I did too. We spent the day installing security cameras and motion lights around the house. I bought new deadbolts for all the doors. Sarah ordered blackout curtains for every window. That was 3 days ago. We haven't seen the creature since, but we know it's still out there. Every night we hear stories on the neighborhood Facebook group about strange noises, blurry figures on security cameras, and impossible footsteps. Some people blame teenagers or pranksters. Others think it's a mountain lion or coyote. They don't want to admit what's really stalking our streets. I haven't gone running since that night. I work from home now, using COVID as an excuse. Sarah sleeps in the guest room. She says my nightmares keep her awake. But it's not the nightmares that bother her. It's the tapping on the windows that starts every night at 2:17 a.m. And the way I sometimes catch her staring at nothing, head tilted at an impossible angle, lips stretched too wide. Last night I woke up to the sound of the front door opening. Through the bedroom window I watched Sarah walk into the street. Her movements were jerky, too fast. She turned toward me, and in the streetlight, I saw her face, smooth and blank like polished bone. Then she started running, her steps a rapid-fire beat on the asphalt, faster and faster until she blurred into the darkness. I'm writing this now from a motel 50 miles away, but I can hear footsteps in the parking lot, moving too quickly to be human. And when I checked my phone just now, it was exactly 2:17 a.m. The tapping on my window has started again. The banging noise above my head wasn't there when I first moved in. I know because I checked every room twice before signing the lease. The rent was too good to pass up, even with all the repairs the place needed. Now at 2 a.m., lying in my bed, I hear footsteps dragging across the ceiling and my throat goes dry. There's someone up there. Or something. I moved in just 12 hours ago. The house sat empty for 8 months before I found it. A 2-story Victorian that needed work but would save me $800 a month in rent. My savings were almost gone after the divorce, and I couldn't keep paying Boston prices. When I saw this place an hour outside the city, I jumped on it. The realtor warned me about the repairs, the creaky floors, the outdated wiring, the draft from the old windows. But she never mentioned anything about the attic. The footsteps stopped directly above my bed. My heart pounds against my ribs. A bead of sweat rolls down my neck despite the January cold seeping through the walls. I hold my breath and listen. Nothing. Just as I start to convince myself I imagined it, a long scraping sound drags across the ceiling like furniture being moved, or claws. My hands shake as I reach for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lights up. 2:17 a.m. I shouldn't investigate. Every horror movie I've ever seen screams at me to get out of the house. But I just spent my last dollars on the security deposit and first month's rent. I can't leave. I need to know what's up there. I swing my legs over the bed, and my feet hit the cold hardwood floor. The old boards creak under my weight. I grab my phone and turn on the flashlight. The beam catches dust particles floating in the air. I'm still wearing my jeans and sweater from moving boxes all day. I'd been too exhausted to change before passing out. The footsteps start again, moving toward the hallway. I follow the sound, stepping as quietly as I can. The floorboards protest with every movement. My phone light sweeps across the walls, casting long shadows from the empty picture hooks left by the previous owners. The footsteps lead me to the end of the upstairs hallway. That's when I see it. A door. A narrow wooden door set into the ceiling that I somehow missed during both walkthroughs. It's not fully closed. A black gap about 2 inches wide shows where it hangs open. My hands turn clammy around my phone. I know I need to close that door, but my feet won't move. A soft thud comes from above, closer to the opening. Then another. Whatever's up there is coming toward the door. My heart hammers so hard I can barely breathe. I force myself forward, one step at a time. The door is just out of reach. I'll need something to stand on. I back away slowly, keeping my eyes on that black gap. In my peripheral vision, I spot a moving box labeled kitchen that I left in the hallway. I drag it under the door, trying to be quiet, but the cardboard scrapes against the floor like sandpaper. The footsteps above stop. I climb onto the box. It shifts under my weight, threatening to collapse. The door is right above me now. Dust and cold air drift down from the opening. I reach up with my free hand, fingers trembling. Just as I touch the rough wood, something on the other side grabs the door and pulls. I stumble back, nearly falling off the box. The door creaks open another inch. My phone light catches something pale moving in the darkness beyond. A hand. Long fingers curled around the edge of the door. The skin is gray and wrinkled, like something that's been underwater too long. I jump down from the box and run. Behind me, the door squeals on its hinges, opening wider. My feet tangle and I slam into the wall, bouncing off and barely keeping my balance. I sprint down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. A loud thud echoes from above, something heavy hitting the floor. Then footsteps, fast and getting closer. I reach the front door and grab the handle. It won't turn. I jiggle it harder, panic rising in my throat. The deadbolt. I forgot about the deadbolt. My keys are in my jacket, hanging by the door. I fumble in the pocket, dropping them twice before I get them in my shaking hands. Above me, the footsteps reach the top of the stairs. The key won't go in. I can't tell which one it is in the dark. My phone slips from my sweaty grip and clatters to the floor, the light spinning crazily across the walls. I hear whatever it is starting down the stairs, each step slow and deliberate. I grab my phone and turn the beam toward my keys. House key, car key, office key. Another house key from my old place. Which one? The footsteps are halfway down. I try a key. Wrong one. Another won't fit. The third key slides in. I twist it hard enough to snap it, but the lock turns. I yank the door open and run outside into the snow. My feet punch through the icy crust as I sprint toward my car, not looking back. The car chirps as I hit the unlock button. I throw myself inside, slam the door, and lock it. My hands shake so badly I drop the keys trying to start the car. I lean down to grab them from the floor mat, and when I sit up, I check the rearview mirror. The front door of the house stands wide open, spilling yellow light onto the snow. A figure stands in the doorway. Even from here I can see it's too tall, too thin to be human. It raises one gray hand and waves at me. I jam the key in the ignition and turn it. The engine coughs once, twice, then roars to life. I throw the car in reverse and stomp the gas. The tires spin on the ice before catching. As I back down the driveway, the figure steps out onto the porch. In my headlights, I see its face, or where a face should be. Just smooth gray skin stretched over a skull with dark pits where the eyes should be. I hit the brakes and shift to drive, then floor it. The car fishtails on the snow as I speed down the empty street. In my mirror, the figure stands at the end of the driveway watching me go. I drive until I can't see the house anymore, until I'm on the highway doing 80, until my hands stop shaking enough to grip the wheel properly. I end up at a 24-hour diner just off the highway, nursing a coffee that's more bourbon than coffee, thanks to the flask in my glove compartment. The waitress gives me concerned looks but doesn't ask questions. I sit there until sunrise trying to figure out what to do next. I can't go back, but I also can't afford to lose the security deposit and rent I just paid. All my stuff is still in that house. Everything I own after Sarah got half in the divorce. My laptop with all my work files, my clothes, the few photos I kept, even my passport and birth certificate are in a box somewhere in that house. The diner starts filling up with the breakfast crowd. I order more coffee, hold the bourbon this time. I need to think clearly. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe the stress of the move, combined with exhaustion and the old house settling, made me imagine things. Houses make weird noises. Everyone knows that. But I know what I saw. That hand, that face, the way it waved at me like it was greeting an old friend, like it had been waiting for me. The sun is fully up now, bright winter light reflecting off the snow outside. I pay my bill and sit in my car staring at my phone. I should call the police. But what would I tell them? That I ran away from my new house because something came out of the attic? They'll think I'm crazy or drunk or both. I pull up the lease agreement on my phone and read it again. Nothing about an attic. Nothing about previous owners or deaths in the house or anything unusual. I Google the address but find only old real estate listings. The house was built in 1887, renovated in 1956, last sold 8 months ago. No news articles, no ghost stories, nothing to explain what I saw. My phone buzzes, a text from my boss asking why I'm not online for the morning meeting. I forgot it was Monday. I text back that I'm having internet installation issues at the new place. He replies with a thumbs up. At least I can work from anywhere with my phone, but I need my laptop. I need my things. I need to go back. I wait until noon when the sun is highest. Everything seems less scary in daylight. I stop at a hardware store and buy a flashlight, better than my phone light, and a crowbar, just in case. The clerk raises his eyebrows but rings me up without comment. The house looks different in daylight. Smaller, less threatening. Just an old Victorian that needs a new paint job and some roof repairs. My boxes are still visible through the windows stacked in the living room. The front door is closed. Snow covers the porch steps with no footprints except mine from last night leading away from the house. I sit in my car for 20 minutes, gripping the crowbar until my knuckles turn white. No movement inside, no sounds, just an empty house on a quiet street. Finally, I force myself to get out. The snow crunches under my boots as I approach the porch. Each step feels like walking through concrete. The key turns smoothly in the lock. The door opens with a familiar creak. Everything is exactly as I left it. Boxes stacked against walls, my jacket still hanging by the door, yesterday's coffee mug on the kitchen counter. The house is cold. I forgot to set up the thermostat yesterday. I leave the front door open, letting in light and cold air. Better than being trapped again. The crowbar is heavy in my hand as I climb the stairs. Each step brings back memories of running down them last night. But now there's only silence. At the top, I pause and listen. Nothing. The attic door is closed. I stand there staring up at it, wondering if I imagined the whole thing. It's just a normal attic door, painted white like the ceiling, with a small brass handle. No scratches, no signs of being forced open. Nothing to suggest what happened last night was real. I need to check. I need to know. The moving box is still there, crushed on one side from my weight. I set my flashlight and crowbar on the floor and drag over a sturdier box filled with books. It's more stable when I climb up. The brass handle is cold against my palm. I take a deep breath and pull. The door swings down smoothly, bringing with it a folded wooden ladder. Dust falls in my face, making me cough. The flashlight beam shows rough wooden floorboards above, covered in dust except for a clear path of footprints leading away from the opening. My heart pounds as I unfold the ladder. It creaks but holds my weight. At the top, I pause with just my head and shoulders in the attic. The space smells musty and cold. My flashlight reveals bare rafters, pink insulation, and stacks of old cardboard boxes pushed against the walls. The footprints lead to the far corner, where something large is covered by a sheet. I shouldn't go up there. Every instinct screams at me to close the door and run. But I need to know. I climb the rest of the way into the attic, keeping my flashlight trained on that covered shape. The floorboards creak with each step. Dust swirls in the beam of light. The footprints end at the sheet. Whatever made them is gone, but they're there. Long, narrow prints too big to be human. I grip the edge of the sheet, count to 3, and pull. It's a mirror. A tall, antique floor mirror in a tarnished gold frame. My reflection looks pale and scared in the dusty glass. Behind me, the attic stretches into darkness. I turn around, sweeping the flashlight beam across the space. Empty. Just boxes and dust and shadows. When I look back at the mirror, there's someone standing behind me. I spin around. Nothing there. But in the mirror, a tall figure stands just over my shoulder. Gray skin, empty eye sockets, long fingers reaching for my neck. I run. My feet tangle in the sheet and I fall hard. The flashlight flies from my hand, beam spinning across the ceiling. I scramble up and sprint for the door, not looking back. Behind me, footsteps follow. I dive for the ladder, missing the first step. My shin slams against a rung as I half climb, half fall down. Something grabs my ankle. Cold fingers wrap around my boot. I kick hard and feel the grip break. I hit the hallway floor and roll, pain shooting through my shoulder. Above me, gray hands grip the edges of the opening. A face peers down, that horrible smooth face with its black empty eyes. I grab the crowbar and swing it at the ladder. The metal connects with wood, sending shockwaves up my arms. The ladder splinters. I hit it again and again until it breaks away from the door. The thing disappears into the darkness as the ladder crashes down. I slam the attic door shut. It hits the frame with a bang that echoes through the house. I lie there on the floor, gasping for breath, waiting for those hands to reach through the wood. But nothing happens. The house is silent except for my ragged breathing. My shoulder throbs where I hit the floor. My shin is bleeding through my jeans where it hit the ladder. The crowbar feels too heavy to lift. But I'm alive. I'm alive and it's still up there. I should leave. Pack what I can carry and get out. But as I sit up, wincing at the pain, I see the mirror in my mind. The way that thing stood behind me, reaching, waiting. And I know it's not just this house. That mirror was here first. The thing in the attic came with it. And now, it's seen me. I go downstairs and find my toolbox in the kitchen. My hands are steadier now as I carry it back up, along with the crowbar. It takes an hour to screw the attic door shut, drilling through the frame into the door itself. I use every screw I have, placing them 2 inches apart all the way around. By the time I finish, the door looks like it's studded with metal. Above me, something drags across the floor. The footsteps pace back and forth, but the door holds. I spend the rest of the day unpacking, trying to ignore the sounds from above. By sunset, most of my boxes are empty. The house looks almost normal, like any other place still being moved into. But I keep the crowbar close, and I don't look in any mirrors. Night falls. The footsteps get louder after dark. They follow me from room to room, tracking my movements through the ceiling. Sometimes I hear scratching, like it's trying to dig through the floor. I turn up the TV to drown it out, but I can still feel it up there, watching, waiting. I don't sleep that first night, or the next. On the third day, I cover every mirror in the house with sheets. The footsteps get quieter after that, but they don't stop. They never stop. Even now, months later, I hear it walking above me. Sometimes it taps on the walls or scratches at the door. Sometimes it whispers my name. I should move out. I know that. But where would I go? How do I know it wouldn't follow me? At least here I know where it is. At least here I can keep it trapped up there with its mirror, pacing in the dark. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying awake listening to those footsteps, I wonder, does it know something I don't? Is there a reason it waved to me that night like it was greeting an old friend? Because lately I've started to notice things. Like how the previous owner's photo shows a tall, thin man with gray skin. Or how my reflection sometimes moves a second too slow. Or how my fingers look longer in certain lights like they're stretching toward something. Maybe I should uncover the mirrors. Maybe I should go back up there. Maybe it's not trying to get out. Maybe it's trying to let me in. I shouldn't have gone hiking that day. The weather report showed a 60% chance of rain, and dark clouds had been gathering since morning. But after 3 weeks of overtime at the office, I needed to clear my head. The Oakwood Trail was only a 40-minute drive from my apartment in Portland, and I knew it well enough. Or at least I thought I did. I parked my Subaru at the trailhead around 2 p.m. The parking lot was empty, except for a rusty pickup truck at the far end. Nothing unusual about that. It was a Tuesday, and this wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot. I grabbed my day pack, locked the car, and headed out. The first mile went smoothly. The air felt heavy and damp, but no rain yet. Pine needles crunched under my boots. A few birds called overhead. The familiar burning in my calves felt good after too many days sitting at a desk. I checked my phone. No signal, as expected. The trail curved uphill through a dense stretch of Douglas firs. That's when I first heard it. A voice, faint but clear enough to make me stop walking. It came from somewhere ahead on the trail. "Help me." The words were flat, emotionless, almost mechanical. I stood still, listening. Maybe I'd misheard. "Help me." There it was again. Same tone, same inflection. My shoulders tensed. Something felt wrong about that voice, but I couldn't place why. "Hello?" I called out. "Is someone there?" No response except another "help me" in that same dead tone. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to get out of there. But what if someone really needed help? What if they were hurt or having a medical emergency? I couldn't live with myself if I walked away and later found out someone had died because I was too scared to check. I moved forward slowly, one hand gripping the strap of my backpack. The voice got clearer with each step. It repeated the same two words every few seconds, like a recording on a loop. Then I saw him. A man sat on a fallen log beside the trail about 30 feet ahead. He wore what looked like hiking clothes, but they were filthy and torn. His hair was matted with dirt or mud. His head hung down, face hidden. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay?" The man's head snapped up. His face was pale, almost gray. His eyes looked wrong somehow, too wide, too fixed. His lips moved, forming the words, "Help me," but the voice came a split second after the movement, like a badly dubbed movie. My whole body went cold. The hair on my arms stood up. Something was very, very wrong here. The man's head tilted at an impossible angle, nearly touching his shoulder. His mouth kept moving, but now multiple voices spoke at once, some high, some low, some barely human-sounding at all. "Help me, help me, help me, help me." I stumbled backward. My heel caught on a root and I nearly fell. The man, or whatever it was, stood up. The movement was too smooth, like he was being pulled by strings. His joints bent in ways they shouldn't. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face. I could hear something moving through the trees parallel to the trail. Fast, too fast to be human. The voices continued, coming from multiple directions now, overlapping and distorting. My lungs burned. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold air. I didn't dare look behind me. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Something brushed against my sleeve. A hand? A branch? I ran faster. The parking lot appeared ahead. I fumbled for my keys, almost dropping them. The thing in the woods screamed. A sound like metal grinding on metal mixed with something that might have been laughter. I reached my car and yanked the door open, throwing myself inside. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas. In my rearview mirror, I saw movement at the tree line. The figure stood there, clothes now in shreds, body twisted at impossible angles. It raised one arm in a jerky motion, like a broken puppet. As I accelerated onto the main road, I heard one final, "Help me," echo inside my head. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city limits. My hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. My shirt was soaked with sweat. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. I called the local police and park rangers. They searched the area but found nothing. No evidence anyone had been there. No unusual tracks. Not even the rusty pickup truck I'd seen. The ranger I spoke to said they'd had no reports of missing hikers or strange encounters. That was 3 months ago. I haven't been hiking since. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear that voice again. That flat, mechanical "help me" that doesn't quite sync with reality. I've started taking different routes to work to avoid driving past any wooded areas. Last week, I saw a news report about 2 hikers who went missing on Oakwood Trail. The only clue was their abandoned car in the parking lot, a rusty pickup truck. The search teams found no trace of the hikers themselves. I know what happened to them. But who would believe me? How do you explain something like that to the police or search and rescue? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe that would be better than the alternative, that something is out there in those woods, something that wears human shapes but isn't human at all. I've been recording all of this in case anything happens to me. If you're reading this, stay away from Oakwood Trail. If you're hiking anywhere and hear someone asking for help, pay attention to their voice, to how their mouth moves. And if something feels wrong, even slightly wrong, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back. Because sometimes the things that ask for help don't really need it. Sometimes they're just hungry. The events of that day replay in my mind constantly. I remember details I didn't notice in the moment, things my brain tried to protect me from. The way the man's skin seemed to shift and ripple under his clothes, how his fingers were too long with too many joints. The absolute stillness of the woods while he was there. No birds, no insects, not even wind in the trees. I've done research since then, looked up local legends, missing persons cases, anything that might explain what I saw. I found some interesting patterns. Over the past 50 years, at least 12 people have disappeared on or near Oakwood Trail. All of them were hiking alone. All of them vanished without a trace. And in several cases, other hikers reported hearing calls for help shortly before the disappearances. The police dismissed these reports as coincidence or confusion. They blamed animal attacks, accidents, people getting lost. But I know better now. I know what's really happening in those woods. I've started gathering evidence, newspaper clippings, old police reports, interviews with locals. Some of the older residents talk about things they've seen in the forest, strange lights, voices that don't match their sources, figures that move wrong. They don't like to discuss it much. Most of them avoid the trails entirely now. Last month, I met an elderly man who used to work as a park ranger in the area. He told me stories about finding footprints that changed shape mid-track, from human to something else. About hearing multiple voices coming from single sources. About cameras and equipment failing for no reason near certain parts of the trail. He showed me photographs from the 1970s. Blurry images of something tall and wrong-looking standing between trees. In one picture, you can almost make out a face, but it's not quite human. The proportions are off, like someone trying to draw a person from description alone. The ranger quit his job after finding a hiker's backpack deep in the woods. The bag was torn open, its contents scattered. Among the typical hiking gear was a camera. When they developed the film, every photo showed the same figure in the background, getting closer in each shot. In the final image, you could see its face clearly, or rather, faces. Multiple human features merged and twisted together, all moving independently. I've been having dreams about that day. In them, I'm back on the trail, but everything's different. The trees grow sideways, the sky pulses with wrong colors, and the thing that looked like a man doesn't bother hiding anymore. It shows me what it really is. I wake up screaming from these dreams, my sheets soaked with sweat. My girlfriend left me last week. She said I've changed, become paranoid. She's right. I jump at shadows now. I can't stand to be in dark places. And I've started noticing things. Little things that most people would miss. Like how sometimes people's voices don't quite match their mouth movements. How their gestures seem slightly delayed, as if they're responding to commands rather than acting naturally. How they repeat phrases with exactly the same inflection each time. Yesterday at the grocery store, I saw a man asking for help finding something. His movements were too smooth. His smile didn't reach his eyes. When he turned his head, it rotated too far. I left my cart full of groceries and ran out of the store. I'm writing all this down because I need someone to know the truth. Something is happening in those woods, something that's spreading. Those things, whatever they are, they're learning, adapting, getting better at pretending to be human. The missing hikers from last week? I drove past their truck at the impound lot. There was something written in the dust on the window. 2 words repeated over and over. Help me. I've started keeping a gun by my bed. I don't know if it would help against these things, but it makes me feel safer. I've installed extra locks on my doors and windows, put up security cameras. I know how paranoid this sounds, but I can't take chances. This morning I got a voicemail from an unknown number. It was my own voice, asking for help. The same two words, repeated in that flat, mechanical tone. When I tried to call the number back, it was disconnected. I'm going back to Oakwood Trail tomorrow. I know it's stupid and dangerous, but I need answers. I need to understand what these things are and what they want. I'm bringing cameras, recording equipment, everything I can think of to document what I find. If you're reading this and I haven't come back, don't come looking for me. Don't trust anyone asking for help on those trails. And if you hear my voice out there, remember, it's not really me anymore. I've left copies of all my research with my lawyer. Maybe someone will make sense of it someday. Maybe they'll find a way to stop these things before they spread further. One last thing. If you ever hear someone asking for help, watch their mouth as they speak. Watch how they move. And if something feels wrong, even slightly wrong, run. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Because the things that live in those woods, they don't need help. They just need you to think they do. End of recording. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound breaking the silence of the forest around us. I was about to drift off to sleep when something stirred me awake. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized our daughter was no longer in her sleeping bag. "Sarah," I whispered, not wanting to wake my wife just yet. No response. I unzipped the tent and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast eerie shadows among the trees, but there was no sign of our little girl. "Honey, wake up." I gently shook my wife. Sarah's not in her sleeping bag. Emily bolted upright, her eyes wide with fear. "What? Where is she?" We scrambled out of the tent, flashlights in hand, calling Sarah's name. The beam of light danced across the campsite, illuminating our picnic table, the smoldering fire pit, and the surrounding trees. But no Sarah. "She must have wandered off," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's split up and search the area. She couldn't have gone far." Emily nodded, her face pale in the moonlight. We agreed to meet back at the campsite in 15 minutes, no matter what. As I ventured into the woods, my heart pounded in my chest. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt menacing. "Sarah," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "Sarah, where are you?" The only response was the rustling of leaves in the gentle night breeze. I pushed deeper into the forest, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder. But there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees and darkness. The agreed-upon 15 minutes felt like an eternity, but I forced myself to turn back towards the campsite. My stomach churned with worry. What if Emily hadn't found her either? As I approached our camp, I saw Emily's flashlight beam. My heart sank when I realized she was alone. "Any sign of her?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Nothing. It's like she vanished into thin air." We stood there for a moment, the weight of the situation crushing down on us. Our little girl was out there somewhere, alone in the dark forest. The thought was almost too much to bear. "We need to call for help," Emily said, her voice shaking. "The rangers, the police, anyone." I nodded, reaching for my phone. No signal. Of course. We were miles from the nearest town, deep in the heart of the wilderness. We were on our own. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "We'll have to go to the ranger station ourselves. It's about 5 miles down the trail. We can't both go, though. One of us needs to stay here in case Sarah comes back." Emily agreed to stay at the campsite while I made the trek to get help. I grabbed a backpack, stuffed it with water and some snacks, and set off down the trail. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked. The beam of my flashlight barely penetrated the thick darkness. Every step I took echoed loudly in the quiet night. and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I tried to focus on the task at hand, on getting help for Sarah, but my mind kept wandering to darker places. What if she had been taken? What if she was hurt? What if... I shook my head, banishing the thoughts. I couldn't afford to think like that. Sarah needed me to be strong, to find help. As I walked, I began to hear strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind or my own footsteps echoing off the trees. But then I heard it clearly. A whisper. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and scared in the vast darkness. The whisper came again, louder this time. I couldn't make out the words, but it seemed to be coming from all around me. I spun in a circle, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Panic began to set in. I wanted to run, to get away from whatever was out there, but I forced myself to keep walking. Sarah needed me. I had to get help. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. I could almost make out words now, but they were in a language I didn't understand. The sound seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, as if the entire forest had come alive. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night around it, moving between the trees. I froze, my flashlight beam fixed on the spot where I'd seen the movement. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then, slowly, a figure emerged from behind a large oak tree. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless save for two glowing points of light where eyes should be. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The creature took a step towards me, and suddenly, I found my voice. I let out a terrified yell and turned to run back the way I had come. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps unnaturally quiet for something so large. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel the creature getting closer. Just when I thought it was going to catch me, I burst out of the trees and into our campsite. Emily was there, her face a mask of confusion and fear. "What's wrong?" she asked, grabbing my arms as I doubled over, gasping for breath. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words wouldn't come. And then I realized the whispers had stopped. The feeling of being chased was gone. I turned to look back at the forest, but there was nothing there. Just the dark line of trees, silent and still. Emily shook me, demanding to know what had happened. As I caught my breath, I told her about the whispers, the shadow creature. She listened with growing horror, her eyes darting to the edge of the forest every few seconds. "We need to get out of here," she said when I had finished. "We need to find Sarah and leave." I nodded, still too shaken to speak. We quickly packed up our essential gear, leaving the tent and most of our supplies behind. As we worked, I kept glancing at the forest, half expecting to see the creature emerge from the darkness. Just as we were about to leave, we heard a sound that made our blood run cold. A child's laughter, echoing through the trees. Sarah's laughter. Without a word, we both turned and ran towards the sound. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, from the direction I had just fled. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run away from the danger I knew lurked in the darkness. But this was our daughter. We had to find her. As we ran, the laughter grew louder. It sounded wrong somehow, distorted and unnatural. But we pressed on, calling Sarah's name, begging her to answer us. And then, suddenly, we were in a clearing. The moonlight seemed brighter here, illuminating a scene that made my heart stop. Sarah was there, standing in the center of the clearing. But she wasn't alone. Surrounding her were figures like the one I had seen earlier. Tall, shadowy creatures with glowing eyes. They stood in a circle around our daughter, their long arms reaching towards her. Sarah turned to look at us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were glowing, just like the creature's. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. "Mommy, Daddy," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the clearing. "I want to stay and play with my new friends." Emily let out a choked sob beside me. I wanted to run to Sarah, to grab her and never let go, but I couldn't move. It was as if the very air had turned to molasses, holding us in place. The creatures began to move, circling around Sarah. Their whispers grew louder, filling the clearing with an otherworldly sound. I watched in horror as Sarah began to fade, then becoming transparent like the creatures around her. "No!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. I lunged forward, breaking whatever spell had held me in place. I ran towards Sarah, my arms outstretched. Just as my fingers brushed against her arm, there was a blinding flash of light. I felt myself falling, tumbling through space and time. And then, darkness. I woke with a start, gasping for air. I was in my sleeping bag, in our tent. Emily stirred beside me, mumbling in her sleep. And there, between us, was Sarah, sleeping peacefully. For a long moment, I just stared at her, my heart racing. Had it all been a dream? It had felt so real, so terrifyingly vivid. I unzipped the tent and peered outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow over our campsite. The forest beyond was quiet and still. No whispers, no shadowy figures, just the normal sounds of a forest at night. As I zipped the tent back up and settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest outside seemed different somehow, as if it was hiding secrets I could never understand. I pulled Sarah closer, wrapping my arm protectively around her. Whatever was out there, whatever I had seen or dreamed or imagined, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let anything take my daughter away. Never. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard a faint whisper on the wind, but this time, I chose not to listen. Some things, I decided, were better left unheard in the dark of the night. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously as I made my way down the empty corridor of the psychiatric ward. It was 2 a.m., and the eerie silence of the night shift hung heavy in the air. I'd been working here for years, but something about tonight felt different. I'm Sarah, a night shift nurse at Pinewood Psychiatric Hospital. Usually, the night passes uneventfully, administering medications, checking on patients, and catching up on paperwork. But tonight, a chill ran down my spine as I heard something that didn't belong in these halls. Laughter. It started faintly, barely audible over the hum of the building's ancient heating system. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Lack of sleep and too much coffee can play tricks on your mind, especially in a place like this. But as I paused to listen, the sound grew clearer. It was definitely laughter, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing through the corridors. My first thought was that one of the patients had woken up. It wouldn't be the first time someone had a late-night episode. I grabbed my clipboard and headed towards the source of the sound, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As I approached the east wing, where our long-term patients resided, the laughter grew louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint its origin. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is someone awake?" The laughter abruptly stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it made my ears ring. I stood there for a moment, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing. Just as I was about to convince myself it had been my imagination after all, I heard it again. This time, it was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway behind me was empty, the doors to the patient's rooms securely locked. And yet, The laughter continued, now sounding like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. With shaking hands, I reached for my radio to call for backup. But before I could press the button, a blood-curdling scream erupted from one of the rooms. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Mr. Johnson, one of our quietest patients. In all the years he'd been here, I'd never heard him make a sound louder than a whisper. I rushed to his room, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. When I finally got it open, I was met with a sight that made my blood run cold. Mr. Johnson was huddled in the corner of his room, his eyes wide with terror, pointing at something I couldn't see. "Mr. Johnson," I said, approaching him slowly. "What's wrong? What happened?" He turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn. "They're here," he whispered. "Can't you see them? They're everywhere." I glanced around the room but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the standard issue bed, desk, and chair. "Who's here, Mr. Johnson?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "The shadows," he replied, his voice quivering. "They're watching us, laughing at us." Before I could respond, another scream echoed through the hallway, and another, and another. Suddenly, it seemed like every patient on the floor was awake and terrified. I ran from room to room, trying to calm the patients, but they were all in a state of panic. Each one told a similar story. They saw figures in the shadows, heard whispers and laughter, felt unseen hands touching them. As I moved from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing movement, dark shapes flitting just out of sight. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The laughter continued, growing louder and more maniacal with each passing moment. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, filling the air with its eerie sound. I tried to radio for help again, but all I got was static. Desperate for backup, I ran to the nurse's station to use the landline. But as I reached for the phone, I saw something that made my heart stop. There, reflected in the glass of the window behind the desk, was a figure. It was tall and dark, with glowing eyes that seemed to bore right through me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I looked back at the reflection, it was gone. My hands shaking, I picked up the phone and dialed the emergency number for hospital security. The phone rang once and twice and 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone picked up, but instead of a person, all I heard was that same chilling laughter. I slammed the phone down, my mind racing. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I looked up at the security cameras, hoping to see some sign of what was going on, but all the screens were filled with static. Just then, the lights began to flicker more intensely. They flashed on and off, plunging the hallway into alternating moments of harsh fluorescent light and complete darkness. In those brief moments of darkness, I saw them, shadowy figures, moving through the hallways, their forms twisting and stretching in impossible ways. I ran back to the patients' rooms, determined to make sure they were safe. But as I approached Mr. Johnson's room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door was open, swinging gently on its hinges, and Mr. Johnson was gone, panic rising in my throat. I checked the other rooms. One by one, I found them empty. All the patients had vanished, leaving behind no trace of where they had gone or what had happened to them. The laughter was deafening now, drowning out even the sound of my own frantic breathing. I stumbled down the hallway, desperate to find a way out, to find help, to find anyone. As I rounded a corner, I came face to face with one of the shadow figures. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form seeming to stretch up to the ceiling. It had no discernible features, just a swirling mass of darkness, but somehow, I knew it was looking right at me. I turned to run, but found my path blocked by more of the figures. They were everywhere, closing in on me from all sides. The laughter reached a fever pitch, so loud it felt like my head would explode. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The laughter cut off abruptly, the lights stabilized, and the shadow figures vanished. I found myself standing alone in the middle of the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then I heard footsteps approaching. I turned to see Dr. Ramirez, the head psychiatrist, walking towards me. Relief washed over me at the sight of another person. "Dr. Ramirez," I gasped. "Something's happened. The patients, they're all gone. And there were these figures." But as he got closer, I realized something was wrong. His movements were stiff, unnatural, and his eyes were glowing with the same eerie light I had seen in the reflection earlier. Now, Sarah," he said, his voice distorted and echoing strangely in the hallway. "There's nothing to worry about. Everything is under control." He reached out to touch my arm, and I recoiled in horror. His hand wasn't a hand at all, but a writhing mass of shadows. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the linoleum floor. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, but I didn't dare look back. I burst through the doors to the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear pushed me forward. I had to get out, had to find help, had to do something. As I reached the ground floor, I heard the sound of voices, normal, human voices. I burst through the door into the lobby, nearly colliding with a group of people. "Help!" I gasped. "Please, you have to help me. The patients, the shadows." But as I looked at their faces, I realized they were staring at me with confusion and concern. Among them was Dr. Ramirez, the real Dr. Ramirez, looking perfectly normal and very worried. "Sarah," he said, stepping forward, "what's going on? We got an alert that there was some kind of disturbance up on the 3rd floor." I looked around, bewildered. The lobby was bustling with activity, nurses and orderlies going about their business as if nothing had happened. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. It was morning. But it was night, I stammered. And the patients, they were all gone. And there were these shadows. Dr. Ramirez gently took my arm, leading me to a nearby chair. "Sarah, you've been working too hard. Why don't you sit down and tell me exactly what happened?" As I recounted my experience, I could see the concern growing on Dr. Ramirez's face. When I finished, he sighed heavily. "Sarah," he said gently, "I think you might have experienced a very vivid hallucination. All the patients are accounted for, and the night shift reported nothing unusual. You've been under a lot of stress lately. I think it's time you took some time off." I wanted to argue, to insist that what I had experienced was real. But as I looked around at the normal, everyday bustle of the hospital, doubt began to creep in. Had it all been in my head? As Dr. Ramirez led me to his office to discuss my episode, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. And just for a moment, as we passed a darkened room, I thought I heard the faintest echo of laughter. The moment we stepped into the quaint bed and breakfast, I knew something was off. The air felt heavy, thick with an unseen tension that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to travel fatigue and the gloomy weather outside. Little did I know, this weekend getaway would turn into a nightmare I'd never forget. My name's Jack, and my wife Sarah and I had been planning this trip for months. We both needed a break from the hustle and bustle of city life, and this charming countryside BB seemed like the perfect escape. The pictures online showed a cozy Victorian-style house surrounded by rolling hills and lush forests. It looked idyllic, peaceful. How wrong we were. As we approached the front desk, an elderly couple greeted us with wide smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They introduced themselves as the Millers, owners of the establishment for the past 30 years. "Welcome to Willow Creek Bed and Breakfast," Mrs. Miller said, her voice syrupy sweet. "We hope you'll find your stay memorable." There was something about the way she emphasized that last word that sent a shiver down my spine. But Sarah, ever the optimist, didn't seem to notice. She chatted happily with the Millers as they showed us to our room on the second floor. The room itself was beautiful, with antique furniture and a large four-poster bed. But as soon as we were alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Isn't this place wonderful?" Sarah exclaimed, flopping onto the bed. "So much character." I forced a smile, not wanting to dampen her enthusiasm. "Yeah, it's great," I lied, my eyes darting to the corners of the room, half expecting to see hidden cameras. As night fell, a storm rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder shook the old house to its foundations. Sarah and I decided to head downstairs for dinner, hoping the company of other guests might ease my growing unease. But when we reached the dining room, it was empty save for the Millers. They sat at the head of a long table, smiling those unsettling smiles. "Where are the other guests?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, I'm afraid you're our only guests this weekend," Mr. Miller replied. "It's the slow season, you see." We sat down to a meal that, while delicious, was punctuated by long silences and strange comments from our hosts. They asked probing questions about our lives, our jobs, our families. With each answer, their smiles grew wider, more predatory. As we ate, I couldn't help but notice odd noises coming from behind the walls. Scratching sounds, like something, or someone, was trying to claw their way out. When I mentioned it, Mrs. Miller laughed it off. "Old houses make all sorts of noises, dear," she said. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. And as the night wore on, things only got stranger. Back in our room, Sarah fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the journey. But I lay awake, listening. The scratching sounds continued, growing louder. And now, I could swear I heard whispers too, muffled voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, the storm still raging outside, but something had changed. The air felt thicker, almost oppressive, and the whispers, they were in our room now. I reached out for Sarah, but her side of the bed was empty. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for the bedside lamp. When the light flickered on, I saw her standing by the window, her back to me. "Sarah," I called out, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" She turned slowly, and I had to stifle a scream. Her eyes were completely black, and her face was contorted into an expression of pure malice. "Sarah's not here right now," she said, but it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, guttural, inhuman. I scrambled out of bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Who are you?" I demanded, "and what have you done with my wife?" The thing wearing Sarah's face laughed, a sound that chilled me to my very core. "We've been waiting for you, Jack," it said. "For so long, we've been waiting." Before I could react, the door burst open. The Millers stood there, their faces twisted into the same malevolent expressions as Sarah's. Behind them, I could see other figures, shadowy, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. Pushing past the Millers, I bolted down the hallway, taking the stairs two at a time. The whispers had become a roar now, filling my head with promises of pain and eternal torment. I reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. I turned, ready to fight my way out if I had to, but what I saw made me freeze in terror. The entire house seemed to be alive. The wallpaper writhed and pulsed, faces pushing out from beneath it, screaming silently. The floor undulated beneath my feet, and the ceiling dripped with a black, tar-like substance. And there, at the top of the stairs, stood Sarah, the Millers, and a host of other things. They began to descend, moving in a way that was decidedly not human. "You can't leave, Jack," Mrs. Miller said, her voice echoing strangely. "No one ever leaves Willow Creek." I backed up against the door, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. I closed my eyes tight, willing myself to wake up. But when I opened them, they were closer. Sarah reached out, her fingers elongated into razor-sharp claws. "Join us, Jack," she hissed. "Become part of the house, part of us." In desperation, I grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and swung it with all my might at the nearest window. The glass shattered, and without a second thought, I dove through the opening. I hit the ground hard, feeling glass cut into my skin. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror that fueled me. I ran into the storm, not caring about the rain that soaked me to the bone or the mud that sucked at my feet. Behind me, I could hear unearthly shrieks of rage. I didn't look back, didn't stop running until I reached the main road. There, by some miracle, a car was approaching. I flagged it down, probably looking like a madman, soaked, bleeding, wild-eyed. The driver, an elderly man, took one look at me and his eyes widened in understanding. "Willow Creek?" he asked simply. I nodded, unable to speak. He sighed heavily. "Get in. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." As we drove away, I finally looked back. In the distance, I could see the BB, looking perfectly normal in the gray light of dawn. But in one of the windows, I saw a figure, Sarah, or whatever was wearing her face. It raised a hand, waving goodbye. The old man drove me to the nearest town, where I gave a statement to the very skeptical local police. They seemed to have heard it all before, nodding sympathetically but clearly not believing a word. When I demanded they go to the BB to save Sarah and stop the Millers, they exchanged knowing looks. "Sir," one officer said gently, "there is no Willow Creek bed and breakfast. That property has been abandoned for decades." But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. And as I sat in that police station, shivering despite the warm blanket they'd draped over my shoulders, I made a vow. I would find a way to save Sarah, to stop whatever evil had taken root in that house. Because the truth was, a part of me was still there, trapped in Willow Creek. And until I could free Sarah, until I could put an end to the horrors that dwelled within those walls, I knew I'd never truly escape. Weeks have passed since that nightmarish weekend, and I've spent every waking moment researching, planning, preparing. The locals whisper about Willow Creek, about the people who've gone missing over the years. They warn me to stay away, to count myself lucky for escaping, but I can't. Not while Sarah is still there. Not while that evil continues to lure in unsuspecting victims. Tomorrow, I'm going back, armed with knowledge from local legends, advice from self-proclaimed paranormal experts, and a desperate hope. I'm returning to Willow Creek to save my wife, to end this once and for all. If you're reading this and I don't come back, let this serve as a warning. Stay away from Willow Creek bed and breakfast. Don't be fooled by its charm, its promises of a peaceful getaway, because behind those walls, in the spaces between what's real and what's nightmare, something waits. Something hungry, something that never lets go of what it claims. And if you ever find yourself on a lonely country road and see a quaint Victorian house with a sign that reads, "Willow Creek Bed and Breakfast," don't stop, don't even slow down. Drive as fast and as far as you can, because once Willow Creek gets its hooks in you, it never really lets go. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was when my GPS started glitching. One moment, I was following the cheerful voice guiding me through the winding forest roads, and the next, the screen went blank. I tapped it frantically, but nothing happened. That's when I realized I was completely and utterly lost. My name is Alex, and I'm an avid hiker. I've traversed countless trails across the country, always relying on my trusty GPS to keep me on track. But today, deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, technology had failed me. As the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the forest floor, a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. I pulled over to the side of the narrow dirt road, trying to get my bearings. The dense canopy of trees blocked out most of the fading daylight, making it difficult to see much beyond a few feet in any direction. I rummaged through my backpack, searching for the paper map I always carried as a backup. But as I unfolded it, my heart sank. This area wasn't even on the map. "Okay, Alex," I muttered to myself. "Don't panic. Just backtrack the way you came." I turned the car around, but as I drove, nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The road twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't find my way back to the main highway. As night fell, the forest took on an eerie quality. Shadows danced in my headlights, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I was running low on gas, and the realization that I might have to spend the night out here alone was becoming increasingly likely. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the beam of my headlights, was a clearing. But it wasn't a natural clearing. It was filled with strange, twisted structures that looked like they'd been cobbled together from branches and bones. I slowed the car to a stop, my curiosity overriding my fear for a moment. The structures were arranged in a circular pattern, each one unique but equally unsettling. Some looked like crude cages, while others resembled bizarre altars. In the center of the circle was a large stone slab, its surface stained with what I desperately hoped wasn't blood. My instinct screamed at me to drive away, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I reached for the gear shift, I noticed something that made my heart stop. Hanging from one of the structures was a backpack that looked exactly like mine. With trembling hands, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no chirping crickets or hooting owls. Just an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I approached the backpack cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing across the clearing. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just similar to mine. It was identical, down to the worn patch on the bottom corner where I'd snagged it on a rock last summer. "This is impossible," I whispered, reaching out to touch the bag. As my fingers brushed against the fabric, a twig snapped somewhere in the darkness behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I turned back to the backpack, determined to unravel this mystery. But as I reached for the zipper, I heard it again. Another snap, closer this time, and then another, and another. Panic seized me as I realized the sounds were coming from all around the clearing. Something was out there, circling me, closing in. I abandoned the backpack and ran back to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. Just as I wrenched it open, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about its proportions. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I stomped on the gas pedal, tires spinning in the dirt as I accelerated away from the clearing. In my rearview mirror, I could see more figures emerging from the forest, all with the same elongated limbs and blank faces. They moved with inhuman speed, chasing after my car as I sped down the narrow road. I drove recklessly, taking turns too fast and narrowly avoiding trees. Branches whipped against the windows, and more than once I felt the car fishtail on the loose gravel. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't, not with those things behind me. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I saw lights ahead. A gas station, its fluorescent sign a beacon of hope in the darkness. I screeched into the parking lot, the car sliding to a stop next to a pump. An old man came out of the store, looking alarmed. "You all right there, son?" he called out. I stumbled out of the car, my legs weak and shaky. There's something out there," I gasped, pointing back the way I'd come. "In the woods. They were chasing me." The old man's expression changed from concern to something darker. He glanced towards the forest and then back at me. "Come inside," he said gruffly. "We need to talk." Inside the store, under the harsh fluorescent lights, the old man, who introduced himself as Earl, listened to my story. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff or tell me I was crazy. He just listened, his weathered face growing more grave with each passing moment. When I finished, Earl sighed heavily. "You're not the first to come through here with a story like that," he said. "Been happening for years. Folks go into those woods and come out, changed, if they come out at all." He went on to tell me about the local legends, about how the forest was said to be a place where the veil between worlds was thin, how there were things out there that defied explanation, things that hunted in the night. "But why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why did they chase me?" Earl shook his head. "Can't say for sure, but from what I've heard, they're always looking for new recruits, people to join their ranks." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the backpack in the clearing. My backpack, or at least an exact copy of it. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling lost and scared in a way I never had before. Earl's eyes met mine, his gaze steady and serious. "You leave," he said simply. "You get in your car, and you drive as far away from here as you can, and you never ever come back." I nodded, knowing he was right. But as I stood up to leave, a thought occurred to me. "What about you?" I asked. "Why do you stay here, knowing what's out there?" A sad smile crossed Earl's face. "Someone's got to warn folks like you," he said. "Someone's got to try and keep people safe." As I drove away from the gas station, following Earl's directions back to the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. The image of those blank-faced figures chasing my car would haunt my dreams for months to come. I never went hiking alone again after that night, and I never relied solely on GPS, because I learned the hard way that sometimes getting lost can lead you to places you were never meant to find, places where the rules of our world don't apply, and where the line between nightmare and reality blurs. So if you ever find yourself driving through a remote forest and your GPS starts to glitch, don't panic, but don't ignore it either. Turn around. Find your way back to civilization, because out there in the darkness, in the spaces between the trees, something waits, something that's always hungry for new recruits. And trust me, you don't want to be next on their list. The sound of scratching coming from my closet jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was just the remnants of a nightmare clinging to my consciousness, but as I lay there in the darkness of my dorm room, heart pounding, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. Something was in there, and it wasn't my overactive imagination. I'm Jamie, a college sophomore who'd never believed in ghost stories or things that go bump in the night. That is, until that fateful evening when everything I thought I knew about reality was turned upside down. It was finals week, and I'd been pulling all-nighters for days. My room was a mess of empty energy drink cans, crumpled papers, and textbooks spread out like an academic war zone. I'd finally crashed around 3 a.m., exhausted but satisfied with my prep for tomorrow's exam. The scratching came again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, my eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. The digital clock on my nightstand cast a faint red glow, illuminating the outline of my closet door. It was closed, just as I'd left it. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous. Of course, there was no answer, just more scratching. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, and I swept it across the room. Everything looked normal. No signs of mice or any other small animals that could be making the noise. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold against my bare feet as I stood up, my legs shaky. I took a tentative step towards the closet, then another. The scratching had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A faint whispering, so quiet I could barely make it out. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Part of me wanted to run, to burst out of my room and never look back. But curiosity, that dangerous human trait, pushed me forward. I had to know what was in there. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open. At first, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just my clothes hanging neatly, shoes lined up on the floor. But then, as I shone my light into the far corner, I saw it. A dark figure, crouched low, its form seeming to shift and waver in the beam of my flashlight. I stumbled backward, a scream caught in my throat. The figure uncurled itself, rising to its full height. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly touching the ceiling, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They glowed with an otherworldly light, fixed on me with an intensity that froze me in place. "Wait, what are you?" I managed to choke out. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with what seemed like curiosity. When it spoke, its voice was like rustling leaves and grinding stones. "We are the forgotten," it said. "The ones who dwell in the spaces between. And you, Jamie, have invited us in." My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. "I didn't invite anything," I protested weakly. The creature's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Oh, but you did. Your late nights, your stress, your fears, they're like a beacon to us." A door left ajar. As it spoke, more figures began to emerge from the closet. They were similar in appearance to the first, but each was uniquely horrifying. Some had too many limbs, others had no discernible features at all. They filled my small dorm room, surrounding me. I backed up until I hit the wall, my heart thundering in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The first creature reached out a long, spindly arm. Its fingers were inches from my face when it stopped. "We want what all forgotten things want, Jamie. To be remembered, to matter." Suddenly, the room felt too small, too crowded. I couldn't breathe. I lunged for the door, my hand closing around the knob. But it wouldn't turn. I was trapped. The creatures closed in, their whispers growing louder. I could make out words now, fragments of sentences. They spoke of loneliness, of the cold, dark places they came from, of their hunger for warmth and life. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to be a dream. When I opened them again, the creatures were gone. My room looked normal, bathed in the early morning light streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought maybe it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. But then I saw it. On my desk, next to my stack of textbooks, was a single black feather. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was unlike any feather I'd ever seen, seeming to absorb the light around it. I didn't go to my exam that day. I couldn't. Instead, I spent hours researching, trying to find any information about what I'd experienced. I found myths and legends from cultures all over the world about shadow creatures, entities that lived in the dark corners of our world, but nothing quite matched what I'd seen. As night fell, I felt a growing sense of dread. I couldn't stay in my room, not after what had happened. I packed a bag and headed to the 24-hour library on campus, determined to surround myself with light and people. But as I walked across the quad, I noticed something strange. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. They moved in ways that shadows shouldn't, stretching and twisting as if trying to reach out and grab me. I broke into a run, not stopping until I burst through the library doors. The fluorescent lights inside were a welcome relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I found a quiet corner and set up camp, surrounding myself with books on mythology and the paranormal. As I read, I began to piece together a theory. These creatures, whatever they were, fed on fear and stress. They were attracted to negative emotions, using them as a bridge to cross over into our world. But knowing what they were didn't make them any less terrifying. As the night wore on, I caught glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement in a dark doorway, a shadow that didn't quite match its surroundings. They were following me. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I couldn't go back to my dorm, but I couldn't stay in the library forever. I needed help. I remembered an old professor, Dr. Eliza Thornton, who taught a class on folklore and urban legends. She had always seemed a bit eccentric, but now I wondered if she might know more than she let on. I found her in her office, surrounded by stacks of dusty books and strange artifacts. When I told her my story, I expected disbelief or concern for my mental health. Instead, she nodded gravely. "You've encountered the Shadowkin," she said, her voice low and serious. "They're as old as human fear itself, always lurking just beyond the edge of our perception. Most people go their whole lives without seeing them, but once you do..." She trailed off, her eyes distant. I realized with a start that she had seen them too. "How do I get rid of them?" I asked desperately. Dr. Thornton shook her head. "You don't. Not completely. But you can learn to live with the knowledge of their existence without letting it consume you. Fear feeds them, Jamie. The less afraid you are, the less power they have." It sounded impossible. How could I not be afraid of these nightmarish creatures? But as Dr. Thornton taught me meditation techniques and gave me protective charms, I began to feel a glimmer of hope. That night, back in my dorm room, I faced my closet again. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm. When the scratching started, I didn't run, I didn't hide. Instead, I opened the door. The creatures were there, just as before. But this time, I stood my ground. "I see you," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I acknowledge your existence, but I am not afraid of you." The creatures seemed to recoil, confusion evident in their glowing eyes. As I continued to speak, affirming my lack of fear, they began to fade, not disappearing entirely, but becoming less solid, less real. In the days and weeks that followed, I worked on controlling my fear. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the shadows seemed to come alive, when the whispers grew so loud I thought I'd go mad. But each time, I faced them, and each time, they retreated a little more. I'm not naive enough to think they're gone for good. I still see them sometimes, lurking at the edges of my vision, but they no longer have the power over me they once did. Now, as I sit here writing this, I can't help but wonder how many others have encountered the Shadowkin. How many have been driven to the brink of madness by their presence? If you're reading this and you've seen them too, know that you're not alone. And more importantly, know that you have the power to face your fears. Because in the end, that's what the Shadowkin really are. They're the embodiment of our deepest fears and insecurities. And while we may never be entirely free of fear, we can learn to live with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control us. So the next time you hear a strange noise in the night, or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, remember my story. Stand your ground. Face your fears. Because sometimes, the monsters in the closet are real, but that doesn't mean they have to win. I never believed in ghosts until the day my coffee mug slid across the kitchen counter all by itself. It was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable in every way, until that moment when I realized we weren't alone in our new house. That was just the beginning of a nightmare that would push me to the brink of sanity and make me question everything I thought I knew about reality. My name's Mike, and my wife Jen and I had just moved into what we thought was our dream home. It was a beautiful old Victorian, a bit run down but with good bones, as the real estate agent had put it. We got it for a steal, probably because it had been on the market for so long. We should have known there was a reason for that. The first few days were great. We unpacked, painted, and started to make the place our own. But then, little things started happening. Keys would go missing, only to turn up in places we were sure we hadn't left them. We'd hear footsteps upstairs when we were both downstairs. At first, we laughed it off. Old houses make noise, right? But then came that morning with the coffee mug. I was standing at the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. My mug, full of steaming coffee, slid smoothly across the granite surface as if pushed by an invisible hand. I froze, my mind refusing to process what I'd just seen. "Jen," I called out, my voice shaky. "Did you see that?" She came in from the living room looking confused. "See what?" I pointed at the mug, now sitting innocently at the edge of the counter. It moved, by itself. Jen gave me a look that was half concern, half amusement. "Honey, are you feeling okay? Maybe you need more sleep." I wanted to believe her, to think I was just overtired or imagining things. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen, and it was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own. We'd wake up to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open. One night, we both distinctly heard a child's laughter echoing through the house, despite the fact that we didn't have kids and our nearest neighbors were a retired couple. Jen was starting to believe me now, but she was trying to rationalize it all. Maybe it was the house settling, or a draft we hadn't noticed. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she'd jump at every unexpected sound. I started researching the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy industrialist. He'd had a large family, but tragedy struck when his youngest daughter died in a fire in the attic. After that, the family had abandoned the house, and it had passed through numerous owners over the years. None had stayed for very long. As I dug deeper, I found forum posts and local news articles about strange occurrences in the house. Previous owners reported similar experiences to ours, some even more terrifying. One family claimed they'd seen a young girl in old-fashioned clothes standing at the foot of their bed. Another swore they'd heard screaming coming from the attic, even though it was empty. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. Our house was haunted. Jen and I argued about what to do. She wanted to leave, to cut our losses and run, but I was stubborn. We'd put all our savings into this place. I wasn't going to let some ghost chase us out. So we stayed, and things got worse. The activity became more frequent, more aggressive. Objects would fly across rooms. We'd feel cold spots, even in the middle of summer. And the whispering. God, the whispering. It was constant, just on the edge of hearing. Like someone was always standing right behind us, muttering words we couldn't quite make out. One night, about 2 months after we'd moved in, things came to a head. We were lying in bed, both of us wide awake despite the late hour, when we heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs. We clung to each other, hearts pounding, as the steps got closer and closer to our bedroom door. The doorknob turned slowly, the door creaking open, and there, in the doorway, stood a figure. It was hazy, like looking through frosted glass, but I could make out the shape of a small girl in an old-fashioned dress. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at us. Then she spoke. "Why won't you leave?" Her voice was echoing, distant, filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "This is my home. You need to go." I found my voice somehow, pushing past the terror that threatened to overwhelm me. We live here now," I said, my voice shaking. "We don't want to hurt you. We just want to coexist peacefully." The girl's form flickered, like a candle in the wind. "No!" she shouted, her voice suddenly angry. "You can't stay. You'll burn too." With that, she vanished, but the temperature in the room plummeted, and we could smell smoke. Panic seized us as we realized what was happening. Somehow, impossibly, The house was on fire. We scrambled out of bed, racing down the stairs and out onto the front lawn. As we stood there in our pajamas, watching flames lick at the windows of our home, I felt a mix of terror and relief. Terror at what we'd just experienced, relief that we'd made it out alive. The fire department came, but by the time they put out the blaze, most of the house was destroyed. The official report said it was faulty wiring, but Jen and I knew the truth. We'd been driven out, just like all the others before us. In the aftermath, as we stayed with friends and tried to piece our lives back together, I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Who was she? Why was she so angry? And why did she feel the need to protect the house so fiercely? I went back to my research, digging deeper than ever before, and finally, I found something that made sense of it all. The industrialist's daughter hadn't died in the fire as everyone believed. She'd started it. It was an accident. She'd been playing with matches in the attic and things had gotten out of control. But in her panic, she'd hidden instead of calling for help. By the time her family realized what was happening, it was too late to save her. The girl was trapped, reliving her worst moment over and over, trying to warn others away from the same fate. In her own twisted way, she thought she was protecting us. Jen and I never moved back to that house. We couldn't, even if we'd wanted to. The damage was too extensive, and the memories too painful. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that little girl. Is she still there, haunting the ruins of the house? Or did the fire finally set her free? I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure I want them. What I do know is that our experience changed me forever. I no longer scoff at ghost stories or dismiss the supernatural, because I've seen it with my own eyes, felt it with my own hands. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. So if you're ever house hunting and you come across a beautiful old Victorian going for a suspiciously low price, think twice. Ask questions. Do your research. Because you never know what or who might already be living there. And some house guests, as we learned the hard way, are impossible to evict. Now, years later, I still catch myself watching for signs. A cup moving on its own, a door closing without a breeze. Part of me is always on alert, always waiting for the next impossible thing to happen. Because once you've seen behind the veil, you can never truly unsee it. The world becomes a different place, full of shadows and whispers and things that shouldn't exist but do. But I've also learned that not all ghosts are malevolent. Some, like our little girl, are just lost and scared. They're trapped in a moment, unable to move on. And while I never want to experience anything like that again, I can't help but feel a twinge of sadness for the spirits left behind. They're a reminder that sometimes the most haunting things are the stories we leave unfinished, the pain we carry with us long after we're gone. So if you ever find yourself face to face with the unexplainable, remember this: fear is natural, but understanding is powerful. Sometimes, the key to dealing with our ghosts, whether they're real or metaphorical, is not to run from them, but to listen to their stories. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our way home. The security cameras flickered, and for a split second, I swear I saw a figure dart across the Egyptian exhibit. But when I rewound the footage, there was nothing there, just empty space and priceless artifacts. That's when I knew this night shift was about to become anything but ordinary. I'm Tom, the night security guard at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's usually a quiet job, just me, the cameras, and thousands of years of human history sleeping peacefully behind glass cases. But tonight, something was different. Something was wrong. It started small. A slight fluctuation in the video feed from the Egyptian wing. I'd been working here for 5 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. The image would distort for a fraction of a second, like someone was tampering with the signal. But every time I checked the system, everything came up clean. I radioed my partner, Mike, who was doing rounds on the other side of the museum. "Hey, you seeing anything weird over there?" There was a moment of static before his voice crackled through. Nah, all quiet on this end. Why? What's up? I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. Probably nothing. Just some funky readings from the Egyptian exhibit. I'm gonna go check it out. Roger that, Mike replied. And give me a shout if you need backup. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the exhibit, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The museum was different at night. The grandeur of the day gave way to something more primal, more mysterious. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the eyes of ancient statues followed me as I passed. As I approached the Egyptian wing, the air grew colder. I could see my breath fogging in front of me, which was odd considering it was the middle of summer and the climate control was supposed to be constant. I swept my flashlight across the room, illuminating sarcophagi, canopic jars, and intricate golden artifacts. Everything seemed to be in place. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, heart pounding. Hello? Is someone there? No response, just the oppressive silence of the museum. I was about to chalk it up to an overactive imagination when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like stone against stone. It was coming from the far corner of the exhibit, where we kept the smaller artifacts. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way towards the sound. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from inside a glass case, a case that held a collection of ancient amulets. I shone my flashlight on the case, and my blood ran cold. The amulets were moving, not falling or sliding, but actually moving of their own accord. They were arranging themselves into a pattern I didn't recognize. I stumbled backward, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of trick, a prank maybe. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I fumbled for my radio. Mike, get down here now. Something's happening in the Egyptian exhibit. Static was my only reply. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath coming in quick, panicked puffs. The scraping sound grew louder, and now it wasn't just the amulets. All around me, artifacts were shifting, moving, coming to life. A gust of wind whipped through the room, despite there being no windows or vents. Ancient papyrus scrolls unfurled, their hieroglyphs glowing with an otherworldly light. The lid of a sarcophagus began to slide open. Terror gripped me, and I turned to run. But as I reached the doorway, I slammed into an invisible barrier. It was like hitting a wall of solid air. I was trapped. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't belong to anything living. I turned slowly, my whole body shaking. There, emerging from the open sarcophagus, was a figure. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with the head of a jackal and the body of a man. Anubis, the Egyptian god of death, standing before me in all his terrifying glory. He spoke, his voice like gravel and wind. You do not belong here, guardian of the night. This is not your domain. I tried to speak, but no words came out. My mind was blank with fear. Anubis tilted his head, regarding me with eyes that glowed like embers. But perhaps you can be of use to us. Us. The word echoed in my head, and suddenly, I realized the room was full of figures, gods and goddesses I recognized from countless placards and history books. Bastet, Horus, Isis, Ra. They surrounded me, their presence filling the room with an energy that made the air crackle. Anubis stepped closer, and I could smell the scent of ancient spices and dried herbs. For too long, we have slumbered, forgotten by the world that once revered us. But now, the stars align. The time has come for our return. I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What do you want from me? A sound like dry laughter came from the jackal god. Want? We require nothing from you, mortal, but you have a choice to make. Serve us, help us reclaim our place in this world, or... He left the alternative unspoken, but I could imagine it all too well. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. Gods didn't exist, and even if they did, they certainly didn't wake up in museums in New York City. But the evidence of my eyes, the chill in the air, the unmistakable presence of power in the room, it all told me this was very, very real. I don't understand, I stammered. Why now? Why here? Isis stepped forward, her voice like music. The world has lost its balance. The old ways are forgotten, and chaos grows. We return to restore order, to remind humanity of the truths they've forgotten. And you want me to help you do this? I asked, still struggling to comprehend the situation. Anubis nodded. You guard this place. You know its secrets, its routines. You will be our herald, preparing the way for our return. Part of me wanted to refuse, to tell them I was just a security guard, not some chosen one. But another part, a part I didn't quite recognize, was thrilled. How many people got the chance to be part of something so cosmic? Before I could respond, alarms started blaring throughout the museum. The gods looked around, startled by the noise. Choose now, Guardian, Anubis growled. Time grows short. I took a deep breath, knowing that whatever I decided would change my life forever. I'll do it. I'll help you. The moment the words left my mouth, I felt a change. It was like a current of electricity running through my body, filling me with a strength and awareness I'd never known. Anubis placed a hand on my shoulder, and knowledge flooded my mind. Secrets of the ancient world, rituals long forgotten, the true history of humanity's relationship with the gods. It was overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. Go now, he said. Fulfill your duty. We will contact you when the time is right. With a gust of wind and a flash of light, the gods vanished. The artifacts returned to their places, and the room looked exactly as it had when I entered. But I knew nothing would ever be the same. I heard footsteps approaching. Real ones this time. Mike burst into the room, gun drawn. Tom, what's going on? The alarms. I held up a hand, suddenly calm. It's okay, Mike. Just a glitch in the system. Everything's under control. He looked at me skeptically but lowered his weapon. You sure? You look different. I smiled, feeling the weight of my new purpose. Never better? Come on, let's reset the alarms and finish our shift. As we walked out of the exhibit, I cast one last glance at the sarcophagus. For a moment, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me. But then they were gone, and I was left with nothing but the knowledge of what I had to do. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. By day, I went about my normal routine, but by night, I prepared. I studied ancient texts, practiced forgotten rituals, and communicated with the gods through dreams and visions. I knew that soon, very soon, the world would change. The old gods were returning, and I was their chosen herald. Part of me was terrified of what was to come, but another part, a growing part, was excited. The world needed this, needed the balance and wisdom the gods would bring. As I write this, I can feel it coming. The air is thick with anticipation, and I can hear whispers of the ancient tongues in the wind. Tomorrow night, when the moon is full and the stars align, it will begin. The gods will walk the earth once more, and I will be there to welcome them. To anyone who reads this, know that change is coming. The world as you know it is about to be transformed. Don't be afraid. Embrace it. For the gods are returning, and with them comes a new age of wonder and mystery. And it all started with a flicker on a security camera, in a quiet museum, on a night that seemed like any other, but turned out to be the beginning of everything. The headlights in my rearview mirror were getting closer, and a gnawing feeling in my gut told me this wasn't just another truck on a late-night haul. Something was off, terribly off, and I had a sinking suspicion that my quiet drive through the snowy wilderness was about to turn into a nightmare. My name's Jack, and I've been driving big rigs across the country for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of weird stuff on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that frigid January night. It started like any other long-haul trip. I was hauling a load of electronics from Seattle to Chicago, a route I'd driven countless times before. The weather forecast had warned of a snowstorm, but I figured I could outrun it if I pushed through the night. That decision would come back to haunt me. I was about 6 hours into my drive, deep in the heart of the Montana wilderness, when I first noticed the truck behind me. It was a black semi, nothing unusual about it at first glance. But as the miles ticked by, I realized it was maintaining the exact same distance behind me, no matter how I varied my speed. Probably just another driver on a similar route, I told myself, trying to shake off the unease that was starting to creep in. But deep down, I knew better. In all my years on the road, I'd never seen another truck mirror my movements so precisely. The snow started to fall heavier, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I slowed down, expecting the truck behind me to pass or fall back. Instead, it closed the gap, its headlights now blazing in my mirrors, so bright I could barely see. I grabbed my CB radio, thinking maybe I could make contact with the other driver. "Breaker, breaker, this is Lone Wolf." "Hey there, driver behind me, you're riding a bit close. Everything okay?" Static was my only reply. The silence on the radio only added to my growing anxiety. I increased my speed, hoping to put some distance between us. The other truck matched me effortlessly, staying right on my tail. That's when things got really weird. As we rounded a bend, I caught a glimpse of the driver in my side mirror. What I saw made my blood run cold. The cab was empty. There was no one behind the wheel. "Impossible," I muttered, rubbing my eyes. I must be more tired than I thought. Hallucinating, maybe. But when I looked again, the sight was the same. A truck driving itself, pursuing me through the snowy night. Panic started to set in. I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my rig to its limits. The speedometer crept up, 70, 80, 90 miles per hour. Dangerous speeds for these conditions, but fear had taken over. The black truck stayed with me, never falling behind, never getting closer. Just there, a constant menacing presence. I fumbled for my cell phone, desperate to call for help. No signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but trees and snow-covered mountains. The chase continued for what felt like hours. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my eyes darting constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors. The storm was getting worse, the wind howling around my truck like a banshee. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a sign, "Rest Area, 1 mile." A plan started to form in my mind. If I could just make it to the rest area, maybe I could find help, or at least a place to make a stand. As I approached the exit, I made a split-second decision. Without signaling, I swerved onto the off-ramp, tires skidding on the icy road. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought my trailer would jackknife, but somehow I kept control. I burst into the rest area parking lot, skidding to a stop near the small, dark building that housed the restrooms and vending machines. As I jumped out of my cab, I realized the black truck hadn't followed me off the highway. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. My relief was short-lived. As I stood there, catching my breath, I heard it, the deep rumble of a diesel engine, growing louder. And then, emerging from the swirling snow like a demon from the depths of hell, came the black truck. It rolled into the parking lot slowly, almost leisurely, as if it knew it had me trapped. As it drew closer, I could see inside the cab clearly. It was definitely empty, the steering wheel turning on its own as the truck maneuvered towards me. I backed away, my mind racing. What was this thing? A ghost? Some kind of advanced AI gone rogue? Or was I losing my mind, hallucinating this entire scenario? The truck stopped a few yards away from me, its engine idling. For a long moment, nothing happened. We faced each other, man and machine, in the eerie silence of the snowy night. Then, slowly, the driver's side door swung open. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything but approach that haunted vehicle. But something else, a curiosity I couldn't explain, drew me forward. As I neared the open door, I felt a blast of Arctic air, colder than anything I'd ever experienced. It was like standing at the threshold of another world. I peered inside, half expecting to see some otherworldly horror. Instead, I saw nothing. An empty cab, pristine and untouched. But there was something else. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Diesel fuel, old leather, and something else. Something that reminded me of my grandfather's attic. A musty, ancient scent that spoke of things long forgotten. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, making me jump. Through the static, I could barely make out a voice. It was deep, gravelly, and somehow familiar. "Jack," it said, my name sounding strange and distorted. "Remember." And then, like a floodgate opening, memories crashed over me. Memories I'd buried deep. Memories of another snowy night, 20 years ago. I was a rookie driver then, cocky and careless. I'd been driving too fast, trying to make up time. And then, the crash. A minivan, a family inside. The sickening crunch of metal, the screams cut short. I'd survived, barely. But the family, they hadn't been so lucky. In the aftermath, I'd convinced myself it wasn't my fault. Bad weather, poor road conditions. I'd buried the guilt, pushed it down so deep I'd almost forgotten. Almost. As the memories washed over me, I understood. This truck, this impossible phantom, had been following me for 20 years. Not just on this night, but every night. In the corners of my mind, in the shadows of my guilt, the voice spoke again, clearer now. "It's time, Jack. Time to face what you've done." I stood there, snow swirling around me, tears freezing on my cheeks, and I knew what I had to do. It was time to stop running, time to face my past. With a deep breath, I climbed into the cab of the black truck. As soon as I settled into the seat, the door swung shut behind me. The engine roared to life, and we began to move. I didn't try to take the wheel. I knew I wasn't in control anymore. As we pulled out of the rest area and back onto the highway, I closed my eyes. Whatever was coming, I was ready to face it. We drove through the night, the truck knowing a path I couldn't see. As dawn broke, we pulled up to a small cemetery I'd never known existed, but somehow I knew exactly why we were here. The truck door opened, and I stepped out. There, in front of me, were 5 gravestones, a family, the family. My legs shook as I approached, reading the names I'd tried so hard to forget. I fell to my knees in the snow, the weight of 2 decades of guilt finally breaking me. "I'm sorry," I sobbed. "I'm so sorry." I don't know how long I knelt there, apologizing to the dead, begging for forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. When I finally looked up, the black truck was gone. In its place was a figure, hazy and indistinct, but unmistakably the father of the family I'd killed. He didn't speak, but his message was clear in his eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. I knew I'd never earn that. But it was acknowledgement, a chance to do better, to live the life I'd stolen from them. As the figure faded away, I felt something shift inside me. The guilt was still there. It always would be. But now it was accompanied by something else. A determination to honor the lives I'd taken, to make my survival mean something. I walked back to my own truck, parked where I'd left it at the rest area. As I climbed into the cab, I knew my life would never be the same. The black truck had forced me to face my past, and in doing so, had given me a chance at a future. Now, every time I get behind the wheel, I remember that night. I drive with care, with respect for the lives in my hands and on the road around me. And sometimes, on long, lonely stretches of highway, I catch a glimpse of a black truck in my mirror. but it's not chasing me anymore. It's watching, reminding me of the promise I made in that snowy graveyard. The promise to live, to remember, and to never, ever forget the true cost of the choices we make on the road. The first raindrop hit the windshield with a soft pat, and I knew we were in trouble. What had started as a sunny hiking trip was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival against nature's fury and something far more sinister lurking in the shadows of the forest. I'm Alex, and this was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my best friends, Mark and Sarah. We'd been planning this hiking trip for months, eager to explore the remote trails of the Cascade Mountains. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, but as we drove deeper into the wilderness, the clouds began to gather ominously overhead. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah said from the back seat, her voice tinged with worry. I glanced at Mark, who was behind the wheel. He shook his head. "We're almost there. It's probably just a passing shower." I wanted to believe him, but the rapidly darkening sky told a different story. By the time we reached the trailhead, the rain was coming down in sheets. We sat in the car, watching the downpour and debating our next move. "We've come this far," I said, trying to sound optimistic. "Maybe we can wait it out in that cabin we saw on the map. It's only a couple miles up the trail." It was a decision we'd come to regret. We donned our rain gear and set out, the mud squelching beneath our boots. The trail, which had looked so inviting on the map, was now a treacherous path of slick rocks and swollen streams. The wind howled through the trees, drowning out our voices and making it nearly impossible to communicate. After what felt like hours of struggling against the elements, we finally spotted the cabin through the curtain of rain. It was a welcome sight, a sturdy log structure that promised shelter from the storm. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin looked old, far older than it should have been based on the recent map we'd studied. Moss clung to the roof, and the windows were dark, reflecting our bedraggled figures like fun house mirrors. Mark reached the door first, giving it a solid push. It swung open with a creak that sent shivers down my spine. We hurried inside, grateful to escape the rain but unable to ignore the oppressive atmosphere that greeted us. The interior was Spartan. A few rickety chairs, a table, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the musty smell of abandonment. "This can't be right," Sarah said, voicing what we were all thinking. The ranger said this was a maintained emergency shelter. I pulled out our map, now soggy and barely legible. "According to this, we're in the right place, but this cabin looks like it's been here for 100 years. Mark was already working on starting a fire, his hands shaking slightly as he arranged kindling in the grate. "Let's worry about that later. Right now, we need to get warm and dry." As the flames flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face peering in at us. But there was nothing but darkness and the relentless pounding of the rain. We huddled around the fire, trying to warm our chilled bones and make sense of our situation. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the thought of spending the night in this eerie cabin was becoming an increasingly likely reality. As night fell, the forest outside seemed to come alive with strange sounds. Howls that didn't quite sound like wolves, rustling that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. We tried to laugh it off, telling ghost stories to distract ourselves from the growing sense of unease. It was around midnight when we heard it, a sharp rap on the door that cut through our nervous laughter like a knife. We froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her face pale in the firelight. Before any of us could respond, it came again. 3 distinct knocks, deliberate and demanding. Mark stood up, his hand reaching for the hiking pole he'd propped against the wall. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering slightly. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, slowly, the door began to open. My heart pounded in my chest as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. But there was something wrong, something off about the way he moved, the way his edges seemed to blur in the flickering firelight. "Apologies for the intrusion," the figure said, his voice oddly hollow. "I saw your fire and hoped you might offer shelter from the storm." Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this stranger as possible. But where could we go? The storm still raged outside, and we had no idea where we were. Mark, always the diplomat, gestured for the man to come in. "Of course," he said, though I could hear the tension in his voice. "There's plenty of room." As the stranger stepped into the light, I had to stifle a gasp. His clothes were outdated, like something from the early 1900s, and they hung on his frame as if he'd been wearing them for a very long time. But it was his face that truly chilled me to the bone. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He introduced himself as Joseph, claiming to be a local who'd gotten caught in the storm while checking his traps. But every word out of his mouth felt like a lie, and I could see that Sarah and Mark were just as unsettled as I was. As the night wore on, Joseph regaled us with stories of the area's history. He spoke of native legends, of spirits that roamed the forests, and of hikers who had ventured into these woods never to return. With each tale, the atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, more oppressive. I found myself nodding off despite my unease, the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the day taking their toll. But every time I closed my eyes, I'd jerk awake, certain that I'd seen Joseph's form shift and change in ways that defied explanation. It was Sarah who first noticed that something was very, very wrong. "Guys," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at the window." I turned, expecting to see the darkness of the storm-shrouded forest. Instead, I saw faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, their features twisted in expressions of agony and hunger. They were there for just a moment, gone in a blink, but the image seared itself into my mind. Joseph's stories took on a more sinister tone. He spoke of a curse, of souls trapped between worlds, forever seeking rest. And with growing horror, I realized he was no longer speaking as an outsider, but as one of them. "You see," he said, his eyes now definitely glowing, "we've been waiting for so long. Waiting for someone to take our place, to free us from this eternal wandering. We bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, when we tried them, were solid as stone. We were trapped, and the cabin seemed to be changing around us, growing larger, more labyrinthine." Joseph, or the thing that had been Joseph, laughed, the sound echoing impossibly in the expanding space. "Welcome to your new home," he said. "I do hope you'll be more accommodating to the next guest than the last caretakers were." What followed was a night of terror I can scarcely bring myself to recount. We ran through endless corridors that shouldn't have existed, pursued by shadows with grasping hands and hungry eyes. Voices whispered from the walls, promising release if only we'd give in, accept our fate. But we didn't give in. We fought, we ran, and somehow, as the first light of dawn broke through the windows, we found ourselves back in the main room of the cabin. Joseph was gone, and the door swung open at our touch. We didn't stop running until we reached our car, the forest around us now peaceful and ordinary in the morning light. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw the cabin shimmer and fade, like a mirage in the desert. We never spoke of that night to anyone else. Who would believe us? But we made a pact, the three of us, to never return to those woods, to warn others away if we could. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I can hear knocking at my door. And in my darkest moments, I wonder if we truly escaped, or if we're still there, trapped in that impossible cabin, living out some comforting illusion, while our souls are slowly consumed. So if you're ever hiking in the Cascades and you come across an old cabin that's not on any map, keep walking. No matter how bad the storm, no matter how tired you are, don't stop. Don't go in. Because once that door closes behind you, there's no guarantee it will ever open again. The sound of shattering glass jolted me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. For a split second, I thought I was dreaming. But as I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears, I heard it again, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard from somewhere downstairs. Someone was in the house, and I was alone. I'm Emily, a 28-year-old freelance writer. I'd jumped at the chance to house sit for my aunt and uncle while they were on a month-long European cruise. Their sprawling Victorian home in the countryside seemed like the perfect place to work on my novel without distractions. Little did I know, I was about to become the main character in my own real-life horror story. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, writing during the day and exploring the charming little town nearby in the evenings. But as the week wore on, I started noticing things. Small things at first, a book out of place, a chair slightly moved. I brushed it off as absent-mindedness, convincing myself I'd moved these items and simply forgotten. But then things escalated. I'd wake up to find all the kitchen cabinets wide open, or my laptop moved from where I'd left it the night before. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the house was settling, causing the cabinets to swing open. Maybe I was more forgetful than I realized. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house felt different at night, as if the very air grew thicker, more oppressive. I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The shadows seemed to deepen, to move in ways shadows shouldn't. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that my writer's imagination was running wild, but I started taking precautions anyway. I double-checked the locks before bed, made sure all the windows were secure. I even considered calling my aunt and uncle, but what would I say? Hey, I think your house might be haunted. They'd think I'd lost my mind. And now, lying in bed, listening to the sounds of an intruder moving through the house below, I wished I'd trusted my instincts and left days ago. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my hand trembling. No signal. Of course. The house was in a notorious dead zone. One of the reasons my aunt and uncle had given me their landline number for emergencies. The landline that was downstairs, where the intruder was. Another creak. Closer this time. They were coming up the stairs. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. I needed a weapon, something to defend myself with. My eyes darted around the room, finally landing on a heavy brass lamp on the dresser. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Gripping the lamp tightly, I crept towards the bedroom door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure the intruder must be able to hear it. I pressed my ear against the door, listening. Silence, then a whisper. So faint I almost missed it. Emily. I stumbled back, clapping a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. How did they know my name? Emily. The voice came again, louder this time. It was coming from right outside the door. We know you're in there. Come out, wherever you are. The voice was sing-song, playful and utterly terrifying. This wasn't a simple burglary. Whoever was out there knew me, had targeted me specifically. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The window? No. I was on the second floor. The drop would likely break my leg, if not worse. I was trapped. The doorknob started to turn, slowly, agonizingly slowly. I raised the lamp, ready to swing at whoever came through that door. But when the door swung open, there was no one there, just the dark, empty hallway beyond. I stood frozen, lamp still raised, staring at the open doorway. This couldn't be happening. People don't just vanish into thin air. Behind you, the voice whispered, right in my ear. I whirled around, swinging the lamp with all my might. It connected with nothing. The room was empty. Panic overwhelmed me. This wasn't possible. I was losing my mind. I had to be. I bolted from the room, no longer caring about stealth. I had to get out of this house, now. I took the stairs 2 at a time, nearly falling in my haste. As I reached the bottom, I saw the front door. Freedom was just steps away. I grabbed the doorknob, twisting it frantically. It didn't budge. Locked. But I hadn't locked it. I was sure of that. Now, Emily. The voice chided, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Did you really think it would be that easy? I spun around, pressing my back against the door. The entrance hall was empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. Who are you? I shouted, my voice shaking. What do you want? Laughter echoed through the house, a sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't just one voice, but many, layered over each other in a cacophony of mirth. We want to play, Emily, the voices said in unison. We've been so lonely here for so long, but now you're here. Now we can have some fun. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, to coalesce into shapes. Human shapes, but wrong somehow, distorted and twisted. I screamed, turning back to the door and pulling on the handle with all my strength. It finally gave way, and I burst out into the cool night air. I ran, not daring to look back, my bare feet slapping against the gravel driveway. I made it to the road and kept running, the lamp still clutched in my white-knuckled grip. I didn't stop until I reached the town, collapsing on the steps of the police station, gasping for breath. The officers were kind but skeptical. They drove me back to the house, flashlights sweeping across the property. Everything looked normal. No sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. They suggested stress, an overactive imagination. Maybe I'd been working too hard on my novel, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. I packed my bags that night and checked into a hotel in town. I called my aunt and uncle the next day, making up an excuse about a family emergency. They were understanding, said they'd arrange for someone else to keep an eye on the place. I didn't tell them the truth. How could I? They'd never believe me. Sometimes, I'm not sure I believe it myself. But in the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain I could hear those voices whispering my name. I'd see movement out of the corner of my eye and freeze, terrified of what I might see if I turned my head. I tried to write it off as a vivid nightmare, a product of stress and an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something had happened in that house, something I couldn't explain. I never went back to that town, never drove down that lonely country road again. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows are deep, I wonder about that house, standing alone in the darkness. I wonder if someone else is there now, hearing those whispers, seeing those shapes in the shadows. And I wonder if they'll be as lucky as I was, if they'll make it out before the game begins in earnest. Because that's the thing about games, isn't it? Sometimes, you don't realize you're playing until it's too late to quit. And sometimes, the stakes are higher than you could ever imagine. So if you ever find yourself alone in a strange house, and you start to notice things that can't be explained, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Because by the time you hear that whisper, by the time you see those shadows move, it might already be too late. The game will have already begun. And trust me, you don't want to play. Not when losing means so much more than you're prepared to give. The moment our car sputtered to a stop on that desolate stretch of highway, I knew we were in trouble. The silence that followed the dying engine was deafening, broken only by the whistle of wind across the barren landscape. Little did we know, our fight for survival was about to begin, and the danger wouldn't just come from the harsh elements surrounding us. I'm Sarah, and what was supposed to be a romantic getaway with my husband Mike quickly turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. We had been driving for hours, the monotonous desert landscape of Nevada stretching endlessly before us. Our destination was a quaint bed and breakfast nestled in the mountains, a place where we hoped to rekindle our relationship after months of stress and growing distance. The sun was setting when our old Chevy gave up the ghost, leaving us stranded in the middle of nowhere. No other cars had passed us for at least an hour, and checking our phones revealed what we already suspected: no signal. "We should have gotten that tune-up before we left," Mike muttered, frustration evident in his voice as he popped the hood and peered inside. I bit back a retort, not wanting to start an argument. Instead, I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs and surveying our surroundings. Miles of scrubland in every direction, with the faint outline of mountains on the horizon. The air was cooling rapidly as night approached, and I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. "Any luck?" I called to Mike after a few minutes. He slammed the hood shut, shaking his head. "No idea what's wrong. We're going to have to wait for someone to pass by and hope they can help." We settled in for a long wait, the temperature dropping steadily as darkness fell. We had some water and snacks in the car, but if help didn't come soon, we'd be in real trouble. The desert nights could be brutally cold, and we weren't prepared for an extended stay. Hours passed, marked only by the slow crawl of stars across the sky. We talked intermittently, our conversation strained. This trip was supposed to fix things between us, but now it felt like it might be the final nail in the coffin of our marriage. It was just past midnight when we saw the headlights. At first, it was just a faint glow on the horizon, but it grew steadily brighter. Hope surged through me as I nudged Mike awake. "Look," I said, pointing down the highway. "Someone's coming." We scrambled out of the car, waving our arms frantically as the vehicle approached. It was an old pickup truck, and it slowed to a stop beside us. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in his 50s, his face weathered and lined. "You folks having some trouble?" he asked, his voice gravelly. Mike explained our situation, and the man, who introduced himself as Earl, offered to take a look at our car. As he worked, he told us he lived nearby and often drove this stretch of road late at night when he couldn't sleep. After a few minutes, Earl straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, looks like your alternator's shot. I can't fix it here, but I'd be happy to give you a ride to the nearest town. It's about 30 miles back the way I came." We hesitated, exchanging glances. Getting into a stranger's vehicle in the middle of the night wasn't ideal, but we didn't have many options. "That'd be great, thank you," Mike finally said. We grabbed our overnight bags from the trunk and climbed into Earl's truck. The cab smelled of cigarettes and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic and vaguely unpleasant. As we drove, Earl kept up a steady stream of conversation, asking about our trip, where we were from, how long we'd been married. His questions seemed innocuous enough, but something about his tone made me uneasy. I noticed his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more often than seemed necessary, as if he was checking to see if we were being followed. About 15 minutes into the drive, I realized we weren't on the main highway anymore. We had turned onto a smaller road, rough and unpaved. Earl?" I said, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. "I thought you said the town was back the way you came." Earl's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Oh, we're taking a shortcut," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Don't you worry. We'll be there soon." Mike shifted beside me, tension radiating from him. I could tell he was regretting our decision to trust this stranger. The truck lurched to a stop in front of a dilapidated house, its windows dark and uninviting. My heart began to race as Earl turned to us, a smile that didn't reach his eyes spreading across his face. "We're here," he said. "Why don't you folks come inside? It's too late to wake up the folks in town. You can stay here for the night and we'll get your car sorted in the morning." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where would we go? We were miles from anywhere, with no idea which direction would lead us back to civilization. As if reading my thoughts, Earl's hand moved to his hip, revealing the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "Now, don't go getting any ideas," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're going to come inside nice and quiet like, understand?" With no other choice, we followed Earl into the house. The interior was sparse and dirty, with peeling wallpaper and floors that creaked ominously under our feet. He led us to a room at the back of the house, pushing us inside and locking the door behind us. The room was bare except for a stained mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. The single window was boarded up, leaving no chance for escape. "What do you want from us?" Mike demanded, his voice shaking despite his attempt to sound brave. Earl's laugh echoed through the door. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough. Get some rest now. You've got a big day ahead of you tomorrow." As his footsteps retreated, Mike and I clung to each other, our minds racing with terrifying possibilities. What did Earl have planned for us? Would anyone even notice we were missing? The night stretched on endlessly, every creak and groan of the old house making us jump. We whispered plans of escape, but each idea seemed more impossible than the last. As dawn broke, we heard movement in the house. Multiple voices, muffled but distinct. Earl wasn't alone. The door swung open, revealing Earl and two other men, all armed. "Time to go," Earl said, gesturing with his gun. They marched us outside to a waiting van. As they pushed us inside, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Cages in the back of the van, some of them occupied by terrified-looking people. Realization dawned on me with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was something much bigger, much more sinister. We had stumbled into the clutches of human traffickers. The van lurched into motion, carrying us away from any hope of rescue. I gripped Mike's hand tightly, tears streaming down my face. How had our simple road trip turned into this nightmare? But as we bounced along the rough road, a plan began to form in my mind. I remembered the Swiss Army knife in my pocket. They hadn't searched us thoroughly. If I could just reach it without them noticing. What happened next was a blur of action and adrenaline. Somehow, in the chaos of the bumpy ride, I managed to free myself and Mike. When one of the men came to check on us, we overpowered him, using the element of surprise to our advantage. The van screeched to a halt as the driver realized something was wrong. In the ensuing struggle, we managed to subdue our captors and free the other prisoners. It was over as quickly as it had begun. We found ourselves standing on the side of the road, surrounded by shell-shocked victims and unconscious kidnappers. One of the freed prisoners had a phone, and soon the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The aftermath was a whirlwind of police statements, hospital checkups, and tearful reunions with worried family members. We learned that we had helped break up a major trafficking ring, one that law enforcement had been trying to crack for years. But even as we were hailed as heroes, the trauma of what we'd experienced lingered. Mike and I clung to each other with a newfound appreciation, our petty arguments from before the trip seeming insignificant in the face of what we'd endured together. Now, months later, we're still dealing with the aftermath. Therapy helps, but there are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'm back in that dirty room, waiting for an unknown fate. But we survived. We fought back. And in doing so, we saved not only ourselves but others who had lost all hope. So if you're ever driving down a lonely stretch of highway and your car breaks down, be careful who you trust. Sometimes, the real monsters aren't the harsh elements or the unforgiving landscape. Sometimes, they're the ones who offer you a helping hand. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the jagged walls of the abandoned mine. I should have turned back the moment I saw the rotting support beams, but curiosity had always been my weakness. As I ventured deeper into the earth, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in this long-forgotten tunnel. My name's Jake, and I'm what you might call an urban explorer. I've always been drawn to abandoned places, fascinated by the stories they hold and the secrets they keep. But this old silver mine in the mountains of Colorado was different. From the moment I squeezed through the partially collapsed entrance, something felt off. I'd done my research before coming here. The Silver Creek mine had been abandoned in the 1920s after a series of mysterious accidents. The official reports blamed unsafe conditions, but local legends spoke of something darker. Miners had reported strange noises, inexplicable equipment failures, and eerie sightings in the deepest tunnels. Some even claimed the mine was cursed. Of course, I didn't believe in curses. At least, that's what I told myself as I made my way deeper into the mine, my boots crunching on loose rocks and debris. The air grew colder and damper the further I went, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water and my own labored breathing. I'd been exploring for about an hour when I heard it, a faint tapping sound like metal on stone, coming from somewhere up ahead. I froze, straining my ears. It couldn't be another explorer. I'd parked at the only access road, and there had been no other vehicles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing unnervingly in the narrow tunnel. "Is someone there?" The tapping stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural growl that definitely didn't belong to any animal I knew. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the tunnel walls as my hand shook, and then I saw it, a flash of movement in the darkness beyond the reach of my light. Heart pounding, I took a step backward, then another. Whatever was down there, I didn't want to meet it. But as I turned to retreat, my elbow knocked against an old mining cart. The resulting clang echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something large moving quickly towards me. Panic overtook me, and I ran, no longer caring about being careful on the treacherous ground. I could hear it behind me, getting closer with each passing second. In my haste, I took a wrong turn. Instead of heading back the way I came, I found myself in a part of the mine I hadn't explored yet. The tunnel here was narrower, the ceiling lower. I had to crouch to keep moving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way. I fell, tumbling down a steep incline, rocks and debris raining down around me. When I finally came to a stop, I found myself in a large cavern, my flashlight knocked from my grip and lying just out of reach. Dazed and bruised, I reached for the light. As my fingers closed around it, I heard something that made my heart stop. The sound of loose rocks sliding down the incline I'd just fallen through. Whatever had been chasing me was coming down. I scrambled to my feet, swinging my flashlight around wildly. The cavern was vast, the beam of light not reaching the far walls. But what I did see made me wish for the darkness again. The floor was littered with bones, human bones, scattered among rusted mining equipment and rotting timber. A noise behind me made me whirl around. There, at the edge of my flashlight's beam, stood a figure. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways I couldn't quite process. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over an emaciated frame, its fingers ending in long, sharp claws, but it was the eyes that truly terrified me, black, soulless pits that seemed to draw in all light. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The creature tilted its head, regarding me with an almost curious expression. Then, slowly, its mouth stretched into a grotesque parody of a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Welcome," it said, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We've been waiting for you, Jake." The use of my name snapped me out of my paralysis. I turned and ran, not caring which direction, just needing to get away. I could hear it behind me, its claws scraping against stone as it gave chase. The cavern seemed endless, a maze of stalagmites and old mining equipment. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. I ducked behind a large rock formation, trying to catch my breath and come up with a plan. "You can't hide from us, Jake." The voice echoed through the cavern. "We know every inch of this place. It's our home, after all." Us? There were more of them. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I peered around the rock, trying to spot the creature. What I saw instead made my blood run cold. All around the cavern, pairs of glowing eyes were appearing in the darkness. Dozens of them, all focused on me. Desperation gave me strength. I spotted a tunnel on the far side of the cavern and made a break for it. The sound of pursuit was immediate, a cacophony of growls and scraping claws. The tunnel was narrow and winding, forcing me to slow down. I could feel them getting closer, their rasping breath seeming to tickle the back of my neck. Just when I thought all was lost, I saw a glimmer of light ahead. Daylight. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted towards the exit. I could feel claws grazing my back, tearing my jacket. But then I was out, tumbling onto sun-warmed rocks, the bright Colorado sun momentarily blinding me. I scrambled to my feet, expecting the creatures to follow. But when I turned back, the mine entrance was silent and dark. There was no sign of my pursuers. For a long moment I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had it been real? Or some kind of hallucination brought on by bad air in the mine? But the torn jacket and the scratches on my back were undeniably real. And when I looked closer at the mine entrance, I saw something that made my skin crawl. Claw marks, fresh and deep, scoring the rock just inside the shadows. I didn't wait around to see if the creatures would venture into the sunlight. I ran back to my car and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I reported what I'd seen to the local authorities, but as I expected, they didn't believe me. They wrote it off as an overactive imagination, maybe triggered by a fall in the dark mine. But they did agree to post warnings about the dangers of the old Silver Creek mine. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. I threw myself into research, looking for any scientific explanation for what I'd experienced. But the more I dug, the more I found stories similar to mine. Tales of miners who'd ventured too deep and encountered things that defied explanation. I've never gone back to Silver Creek Mine, and I've given up urban exploration altogether. Some places, I've learned, are abandoned for a reason. Some secrets are better left buried. But on quiet nights, when the wind whistles just right, I swear I can still hear that rasping voice. "We've been waiting for you, Jake." And I wonder, are they still down there, in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting explorer to venture into their domain? I may never know the full truth of what lurks in the depths of Silver Creek Mine. But one thing I know for certain, there are things in this world that defy our understanding, things that hide in the dark places of the earth, and sometimes, curiosity can lead us into dangers we're not prepared to face. So if you ever find yourself drawn to explore an abandoned place, remember my story, and ask yourself, is satisfying your curiosity worth the risk of encountering something that was never meant to see the light of day? The waves lapped gently against the shore, but the peaceful sound did nothing to calm my growing sense of unease. As I stood on the beach of this seemingly idyllic island resort, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Little did I know, my relaxing vacation was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival against an unseen, sinister force. My name's Olivia, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for months. After a grueling year at work, I desperately needed a break. When I saw the ad for Sunset Cove Resort, a small, exclusive getaway on a private island in the Caribbean, it seemed like the perfect escape. The website promised crystal clear waters, pristine beaches, and a chance to truly get away from it all. If only I'd known how literal that promise would turn out to be. The first few days were everything I'd hoped for. The resort was beautiful, the staff attentive, and the other guests friendly. There were only about 20 of us, which gave the place an intimate, exclusive feel. I spent my days lounging by the pool, snorkeling in the coral reefs, and enjoying exotic cocktails at the beachside bar. It was on the fourth day that I first noticed something odd. I was chatting with an elderly couple, the Johnsons, at breakfast when I realized I hadn't seen the young honeymooners who'd been at the next table every morning. When I mentioned this to the Johnsons, they looked at me blankly. "What honeymooners?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. I described the couple, a tall, dark-haired man and a petite blonde woman. They'd been impossible to miss, always giggling and holding hands. Mr. Johnson shook his head. "I'm sorry, dear, but I don't recall seeing anyone like that. Are you sure it was at this resort?" I felt a chill run down my spine. How could they not remember? The couple had been so vivacious, so present. But as I looked around the dining room, I realized the Johnsons were right. The honeymooners were nowhere to be seen. Throughout the day, I kept an eye out for the missing couple, but there was no sign of them. When I asked one of the staff members, a friendly bartender named Miguel, he gave me the same blank look the Johnsons had. "I'm sorry, señorita," he said with a shrug. "I don't remember any couple like that. Perhaps they checked out early." But I knew that couldn't be right. The resort's boat only came twice a week, and the next departure wasn't for another 3 days. As the day wore on, my unease grew. I started noticing other little things that seemed off. The number of guests at dinner seemed smaller than it had been the night before. And hadn't there been a family with 2 young children? I couldn't spot them anywhere. That night I had trouble sleeping. The sound of the waves, which had been so soothing before, now seemed ominous. I tossed and turned, plagued by vague nightmares of people disappearing into thin air. The next morning, I woke early, determined to get to the bottom of what was going on. I headed to the front desk, intending to ask about the missing guests, but as I approached, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The lobby was empty, not just of guests, but of staff as well. The desk was unmanned, the computers dark. It was as if everyone had simply vanished overnight. Heart pounding, I ran back to my room and grabbed my phone. No signal, of course. There never had been on the island. I tried the room's landline, but it was dead. Panic rising, I rushed out onto the beach, hoping to spot the resort's boat. But the dock was empty, the calm waters unbroken by any sign of an approaching vessel. As the reality of my situation sank in, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to find Miguel standing there, but he looked different. His usual friendly smile was gone, replaced by a blank, almost robotic expression. "Is everything all right, señorita?" he asked, his voice oddly flat. "Miguel, what's going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where is everyone?" He tilted his head, regarding me with eyes that suddenly seemed too dark, too empty. "Everyone is where they should be," he said, "and soon you will be too." I backed away, my heart racing. This wasn't Miguel, it couldn't be. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get away. I could hear footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried, as if whatever was chasing me knew it would catch me eventually. I ran into the jungle that covered the center of the island, branches whipping at my face as I pushed through the dense foliage. The humid air felt thick in my lungs, and sweat poured down my face, but I didn't dare stop. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing and froze. Before me stood an enormous stone structure, ancient and weathered. It looked like some kind of temple with steep steps leading up to a dark entrance. Symbols I didn't recognize were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. I heard movement in the jungle behind me. With no other choice, I started climbing the temple steps. The stone was slick with moss, and my feet kept slipping, but fear drove me onward. As I neared the top, I heard chanting coming from inside the temple. The language was like nothing I'd ever heard before, full of harsh consonants and guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. I peered into the entrance. And what I saw made me gasp in horror. The missing guests were there, standing in a circle around a glowing pit in the center of the room. But they weren't themselves anymore. Their eyes were blank, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by unseen strings. In the center of the circle stood a figure that defied description. It was tall, at least 8 feet, with skin that seemed to shift and change color like oil on water. Its head was elongated and eyeless, with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. As I watched, frozen in terror, the creature reached out and touched one of the guests, the young bride I'd been looking for. Her body went rigid, and then she simply faded away, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I must have made a sound because suddenly, every head in the room turned towards me. The creature let out a sound that was part roar, part scream, and started moving towards me with impossible speed. I turned and ran back down the steps, my feet barely touching the stone as I flew downwards. I could hear the others behind me, their movements coordinated and relentless. I burst out of the jungle and onto the beach, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. The resort stood before me, looking peaceful and inviting, as if nothing had changed. For a moment, I was tempted to run inside, to pretend this had all been a bad dream. But I knew the truth now. This place, this entire island, was a trap, a feeding ground for something ancient and hungry. I spotted a small motorboat pulled up on the beach, the kind used for water sports. Without hesitation, I pushed it into the water and jumped in, praying the key would be there. My hand closed around cold metal, and I could have cried with relief. The engine roared to life just as the others emerged from the jungle. I saw Miguel in the lead, his face twisted into an inhuman snarl. Behind him, the creature emerged, its form seeming to warp and distort the very air around it. I gunned the engine, the boat leaping forward into the waves. As I sped away from the island, I looked back one last time. The creature stood on the beach, surrounded by its puppets, and though it had no eyes, I swear it was looking right at me. I don't know how long I was out on the water. Hours blurred into days as I drifted, the relentless sun beating down on me. When I was finally rescued by a passing cargo ship, I was delirious from dehydration and sunburn. No one believed my story, of course. They found no record of a Sunset Cove resort, and satellite images showed nothing but unbroken jungle on the coordinates I gave them. The official explanation was that I'd had some kind of mental break, imagined the whole thing while lost at sea. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there, hiding behind a facade of tropical paradise. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear that unearthly chanting, carried on the wind from some distant shore. So if you're planning a vacation and you come across an ad for a secluded island resort that seems too good to be true, think twice. Because sometimes, getting away from it all is the last thing you want to do. The old bus creaked and groaned as it lumbered down the dark highway, its headlights cutting through the thick fog like dull knives. I was the only passenger, and as I peered out the grimy window, a chill ran down my spine. Something about this night felt wrong, as if the very air was charged with an unseen menace. Little did I know, my journey was about to take a terrifying turn into the heart of a nightmare. My name's Lisa, and I was on my way to visit my grandmother in a small town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a last-minute trip. Gran had fallen ill, and the doctors weren't optimistic. I'd caught the last bus out of the city, determined to see her one last time. The bus was old and run down, the kind of vehicle that had seen better days decades ago. The driver, a grizzled man who looked as ancient as the bus itself, hadn't said a word since I'd boarded. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional squeak of worn suspension. As we wound our way through the mountains, the fog grew thicker. I could barely see the road ahead, and I wondered how the driver was managing to navigate these treacherous curves. I glanced at my watch, 11:45 p.m. We should have reached the town by now. I was about to ask the driver if we were on the right route when I saw it. A figure, standing at the side of the road, arm outstretched in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Despite the poor visibility, I could make out that it was a woman, her long hair whipping in the wind. To my surprise, the bus began to slow down. "Wait," I called out to the driver. "Are we stopping? Is that safe?" The driver didn't respond. He pulled the bus over to the side of the road, the brakes squealing in protest. The doors hissed open, and the woman climbed aboard. As she passed by me, I caught a whiff of something unpleasant, a musty, earthy smell like wet leaves and decay. She took a seat a few rows behind me, and I heard her mumbling something under her breath. An uneasy silence fell over the bus as we started moving again. I tried to catch a glimpse of the new passenger in the reflection of my window, but all I could see was a dark shape. Minutes ticked by, and the unease in my stomach grew. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but every instinct was screaming at me to get off this bus. I stood up, intending to speak to the driver, when suddenly the bus lurched violently. I was thrown off my feet, crashing into the seat across the aisle. The driver was wrestling with the steering wheel, and through the windshield, I could see we were no longer on the road. We were plunging down a steep embankment, trees whipping past us at alarming speed. With a sickening crunch, the bus came to a stop. My head was spinning, and I tasted blood in my mouth. As I struggled to my feet, I realized the driver was no longer in his seat. The windshield was shattered, and I could see a dark shape crumpled on the ground outside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is everyone okay?" No response. I turned to check on the woman who had just boarded, but her seat was empty. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I was alone in the wrecked bus. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I was in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, with no way to call for help. With no other choice, I made my way to the front of the bus and climbed out through the broken windshield. The fog was so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The driver's body was nowhere to be seen. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed through the trees, and then I heard it, a response, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like someone calling for help. Against my better judgment, I started moving towards the sound. The forest was dense, the underbrush snagging at my clothes as I pushed through. The voice grew louder, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't seem to reach its source. Suddenly, I broke through into a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated house. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, its windows dark and empty, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The voice was coming from inside. Every fiber of my being told me to turn back, to run as far and as fast as I could. But what if it was the driver or the woman? I couldn't just leave them. With trembling hands, I pushed open the front door. It creaked ominously, the sound echoing through the empty house. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The responding cry came from upstairs. I climbed the rotting steps, wincing at every groan and creak. The upper floor was a maze of corridors and closed doors. I tried each one, finding nothing but empty, dust-covered rooms. As I reached the last door, I hesitated. The voice had stopped. An unnatural silence had fallen over the house, broken only by the pounding of my heart. I pushed open the door. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, and on that chair sat an old radio, crackling with static. As I watched in horror, a voice emerged from the radio, my voice, calling for help. I backed away, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of nightmare. I turned to run, only to find my path blocked. The woman from the bus stood in the doorway, but she was no longer human. Her face was a grotesque mask of rotting flesh, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Welcome home, Lisa," she said, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat as I bolted past her. I flew down the stairs, not caring about the creaks and groans of the old wood. I could hear her behind me, her movements unnaturally fast. I burst out of the house and into the foggy night. But the forest had changed. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead. But the terror kept me going. The knowledge that something inhuman was pursuing me through this impossible forest. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw lights ahead. A road, civilization. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of speed. I broke through the tree line and onto the asphalt, waving my arms frantically at an approaching car. It screeched to a halt, and a bewildered couple peered out at me. "Please," I gasped. "You have to help me. There's something in the woods. It's chasing me." The couple exchanged worried glances. The man stepped out of the car, approaching me cautiously. "Miss, are you all right? What are you doing out here in the middle of the night?" I turned to point at the forest, to explain about the bus crash and the house, but the words died in my throat. There was no forest, just an empty field stretching out into the darkness. The couple drove me to the nearest town, where I told my story to skeptical police officers. They found no evidence of a bus crash, no mysterious house in the woods. According to them, I was miles away from where I should have been, with no explanation of how I got there. The official report chalked it up to confusion and trauma, possibly triggered by grief over my grandmother's illness. They suggested I had wandered away from the bus during a rest stop, gotten lost, and imagined the whole ordeal. But I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that radio, playing my own voice back to me in an endless loop. And in my dreams, I'm still running through that shifting, impossible forest, pursued by something that should not exist. I never made it to my grandmother's. By the time I got there, she had already passed away. But sometimes I wonder, was it really her illness that prompted that urgent late-night trip? Or was it something else? Something that knew exactly how to lure me into its trap? I don't take buses anymore. I don't travel at night if I can help it. And if I ever see a hitchhiker on a foggy road, I keep driving. Because I know now that some rides lead to places you can never return from, and some passengers are better left where you find them. The first email arrived on a Tuesday. "I know what you did," it read. Nothing more. I laughed it off as spam, but as the messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last, I realized with growing horror that someone was watching my every move, and they knew things about me that no one else should. My name is Rachel, and until a month ago, I was just another face in the crowd. A 32-year-old software developer living alone in my cozy apartment in Seattle. My life was comfortably predictable. Work, gym, maybe drinks with friends on the weekend. Nothing exceptional, nothing to draw unwanted attention, or so I thought. It started innocently enough. That first email, I barely glanced at before deleting, but then came another the next day. "You look tired at work today. Maybe skip that 3 p.m. coffee?" I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. How could they know about my afternoon coffee run? I changed my email password immediately, convinced it was some sort of prank. Maybe a coworker with too much time on their hands. But the emails kept coming, each one from a different address, each one revealing intimate details of my daily life. "That red blouse looks nice on you. Brings out the color in your cheeks. Your cat seems lonely. Maybe you should play with her more instead of working late. Leftover Thai food again. You should really learn to cook." With each message, my paranoia grew. I started checking over my shoulder constantly, convinced I was being followed. I scoured my apartment for hidden cameras, changed all my passwords, even bought new locks for my doors. But nothing stopped the emails. I went to the police, but they were maddeningly unhelpful. Without any explicit threats, they said there was little they could do. They suggested I block the email addresses and report them as spam, as if I hadn't already tried that. Weeks passed, and the messages became more frequent, more intrusive. They knew about private phone conversations, about thoughts I'd only written in my journal. It was as if the sender could read my mind. You shouldn't feel guilty about what happened to your sister. It wasn't your fault. That one made my blood run cold. My sister's accident was something I'd never spoken about to anyone. It was a closely guarded secret, a source of shame and regret that I'd buried deep inside. How could they possibly know? I stopped sleeping, stopped eating. Every ping of my phone, every notification on my computer sent me into a panic. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then came the email that changed everything. I'm tired of this game, Rachel. It's time we meet face to face. Come to Volunteer Park tomorrow at noon. Come alone, or everyone will know your secret. I knew I shouldn't go. Every rational part of my brain screamed that it was a trap, but I was desperate for answers, and the threat of exposure terrified me more than any physical danger. The park was busy that day, families enjoying the rare Seattle sunshine. I sat on a bench near the conservatory, my heart racing, scanning every face for a sign of recognition. At exactly noon, my phone buzzed. Another email. Look to your left. I turned, and there she was, a woman, probably in her early 40s, with short dark hair and piercing green eyes. She smiled as she sat down next to me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Hello, Rachel," she said, her voice surprisingly warm. "I'm glad you came." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound strong. "Why are you doing this to me?" She laughed, a sound that was both melodious and terrifying. "Oh, Rachel, I'm doing this for you. To protect you. Protect me. From what?" Her smile faded, replaced by a look of intense concern. "From yourself, of course. From the guilt that's eating you alive. I know how much you've suffered since Sarah's accident." I felt the blood drain from my face. "How do you know about Sarah?" "I know everything about you, Rachel. I've been watching you for a very long time. Since before the accident, in fact." My mind reeled. This was impossible. "But why?" She sighed, looking out over the park. "Because you're special, Rachel. You have a gift, a power you don't even realize. And there are people who would exploit that power if they knew about it." I shook my head, trying to make sense of her words. "I don't understand. What power? I'm just a normal person." She turned back to me, her green eyes seeming to look right through me. "You can alter reality, Rachel, with your thoughts, your emotions. You've been doing it unconsciously for years. The accident wasn't your fault, but it was caused by your power, your fear, your anger. It manifested in a way you couldn't control." I stood up, backing away from her. "You're insane. This is crazy. I'm leaving." But as I turned to go, I saw it. The world around us had shifted. The families, the trees, the very sky itself seemed to waver, like a mirage in the desert. And in that moment, I knew she was telling the truth. Memories came flooding back. Strange occurrences throughout my life that I dismissed or rationalized away. Objects moving on their own. Unlikely coincidences. Moments where reality itself seemed to bend to my will. I sank back onto the bench, my legs weak. "Who are you really?" I whispered. "My name is Elena," she said softly. "I'm like you. We're part of a small group of people with abilities similar to yours. We've been watching you, protecting you from those who would use your power for their own gain." "The emails. A necessary evil," Elena said, at least having the grace to look somewhat ashamed. "We needed to push you, to make you confront your power. It was the only way to wake you up to the truth." My mind was spinning. If what she was saying was true, it changed everything. My whole life, my understanding of reality itself, was a lie. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elena smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "Now, we teach you. We help you understand and control your gift. And then, if you choose, you join us in protecting others like yourself." As if on cue, two more people approached us. A tall, athletic man with kind eyes, and a younger woman with a mischievous grin. Elena introduced them as Michael and Zoe, other members of their group. "We have a lot to show you, Rachel," Michael said, his deep voice reassuring. "A whole world you never knew existed." Zoe grinned, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "Just wait until you see what you can really do. It's going to blow your mind." I looked at each of them in turn, these strangers who somehow knew me better than I knew myself. Part of me was still terrified, still wanted to run away and pretend none of this was happening. But a larger part, a part I was only just beginning to recognize, felt like I was finally waking up from a long, confusing dream. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Show me." The world shifted again, but this time I was ready for it. Colors became more vibrant, sounds more clear. I could feel the energy of the earth beneath my feet, the whisper of thoughts from the people around us. Elena took my hand, her touch electric. "Welcome to the real world, Rachel. Your journey is just beginning." As we walked out of the park, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The guilt, the fear, the constant feeling of being watched, it all melted away. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. I don't know what the future holds. Learning to control this power, to use it responsibly, won't be easy. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a purpose, a destiny. Those emails that seemed so threatening, so invasive, turned out to be the key to my liberation. They forced me to confront a truth about myself that I'd been running from my whole life. So if you ever receive a mysterious email, one that seems to know too much about you, don't be too quick to dismiss it. It might just be the wake-up call you never knew you needed. Because in this world of infinite possibilities, of realities that shift and change with a thought, the only true limits are the ones we place on ourselves. And I, for one, am ready to break free of those limits and explore the full extent of what I can do. My name is Rachel, and I can change reality. This is where my story really begins. The champagne flute slipped from my fingers, shattering on the polished deck with a sound that seemed to echo across the vast ocean. As I stared at the glittering shards, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the sea breeze. In that moment, I knew something was terribly wrong on this ship. Little did I know, this luxurious cruise would soon become a nightmare from which there might be no escape. My name is Daniel, and I'm a travel writer. This was supposed to be just another assignment, a week-long Caribbean cruise on the newest, most opulent ship in the fleet. The Diamond Duchess was a floating palace, with amenities that put most five-star resorts to shame. I'd been looking forward to lazy days by the pool, gourmet meals, and maybe a little romance if I was lucky. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. I lounged in the sun, indulged in ridiculous cocktails, and chatted up my fellow passengers. There was a festive atmosphere on board, everyone eager to make the most of their vacation. It was on the third night that things started to feel off. I was at the ship's main restaurant, enjoying a lavish dinner, when I overheard a heated conversation at the next table. "I'm telling you, I saw her this morning," a woman was saying, her voice low but intense. "But that's impossible. She can't be here." Her companion, an older man, shushed her.
"Keep your voice down. We don't know who might be listening." I tried not to eavesdrop, but their furtive glances and hushed tones piqued my curiosity. As a writer, I have a nose for a good story, and this smelled like one. After dinner, I decided to do a bit of investigating. I struck up conversations with other passengers, casually steering the topics towards any unusual occurrences. Most people hadn't noticed anything amiss, but a few shared odd experiences. A honeymooning couple swore they'd seen a man walk through a closed door. An elderly woman complained that her jewelry had vanished from her locked safe, only to reappear in her suitcase. I chalked it up to the power of suggestion and too many tropical drinks. But then, on the fourth day, it happened. I was lounging by the pool when I spotted her, a striking woman with long dark hair and a red swimsuit. She looked familiar, and after a moment, I realized why. She was the spitting image of a passenger I'd chatted with on the first day, a vivacious blonde named Cynthia. As I watched, puzzled, the dark-haired woman turned and locked eyes with me. The intensity of her gaze sent a shiver through me. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Not just walking away, but literally vanished into thin air. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by too much sun.
But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. Around 2 a.m., I decided to take a walk, hoping the night air might clear my head. The ship was eerily quiet as I wandered the decks. The only sounds were the hum of the engines and the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. As I turned a corner, I quite literally ran into another passenger, a man I recognized from my dinner table the first night. "Oh, I'm sorry," I started to say, but the words died in my throat. The man's face was contorted in terror, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're taking us," he whispered, gripping my arms with surprising strength. "One by one, we're all going to disappear." Before I could respond, he shoved past me and ran down the corridor, disappearing into the darkness. Shaken, I decided to head back to my cabin. But as I turned to go, I heard a scream, distant but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction the man had run. Every instinct told me to run, to lock myself in my cabin and pretend this wasn't happening. But my curiosity, that same drive that made me a writer, propelled me forward. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The scream had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A low, pulsing hum that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I found myself in a part of the ship I didn't recognize. The sleek, modern decor gave way to bare metal walls and exposed pipes. The air was thick and humid, carrying a strange, metallic scent. And then I saw it. At the end of the corridor was a door unlike any I'd seen on the ship. It was massive, made of some dark material that seemed to absorb the light around it, and it was open. As I approached, the humming grew louder. I peered inside, and my world turned upside down. The room beyond was impossible. It was vast, far larger than the ship could possibly contain, and it was filled with pods, hundreds of them, lining the walls and suspended from the ceiling. Each one was about the size of a person, glowing with a sickly green light. With mounting horror, I realized I could see faces inside the pods. Passengers from the ship, their expressions frozen in terror or confusion. And in the center of the room, more were appearing. I watched, paralyzed, as a woman materialized out of thin air, only to be immediately encased in a pod that seemed to grow around her. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, some kind of mass hallucination. Fascinating, isn't it? I whirled around to find myself face to face with the captain of the ship. But his uniform was different now, made of the same light-absorbing material as the door, and his eyes were solid black, without iris or pupil. What is this?" I managed to stammer. The thing wearing the captain's face smiled, revealing teeth that were just a little too sharp. "This, Mr. Travel Writer, is a harvest. Your kind makes such excellent specimens, so full of emotions, of experiences. You'll feed us for centuries." I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The humming had grown louder, and I could feel it reverberating in my bones. "Oh, don't worry," the creature said, its voice almost gentle. "You won't remember any of this. When we're done, we'll put you all back, with new memories of a lovely cruise. You'll write a glowing review, I'm sure, and then we'll move on to the next ship, the next batch of unsuspecting humans." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in horror as a pod began to form around me, its green glow enveloping my vision. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the creature's voice. "Sweet dreams, Daniel, and thank you for your contribution." I woke up in my cabin, drenched in sweat. For a moment I was disoriented, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to the edges of my mind. But as I looked around the familiar room, the details of the dream faded away, leaving only a vague sense of unease. I shook it off and got ready for the day. It was the last day of the cruise, and I had a review to write. As I sat down at the desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, I hesitated. For some reason, I had the strangest urge to warn people away from this ship, to tell them not to come. But that was ridiculous. It had been a wonderful trip, hadn't it? I began to type. "The Diamond Duchess offers a cruise experience like no other. From the moment you step on board, you'll feel like you've entered another world." As I wrote, a small part of my mind screamed in protest, but that voice grew fainter with each word, until it faded away entirely. By the time I finished the review, I was smiling, already looking forward to my next cruise. After all, what could be more relaxing than a week at sea, far from the cares of the world? Just be sure to book your trip on the Diamond Duchess. I hear they're planning something special for their next voyage, something unforgettable. The distress call crackled through my radio, breaking the monotonous silence of the forest. "Help, please, lost." The voice was faint, desperate, and unmistakably human. As I reached for my gear, I had no idea that this routine rescue mission would lead me into the heart of an ancient, terrifying mystery. My name is Alex, and I've been a search and rescue volunteer in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things in these woods, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came in. A hiker had gone missing in a remote area of the Cascade Mountains, a region known for its treacherous terrain and unpredictable weather. As I geared up and headed out with my team, I couldn't shake an odd feeling of dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. The first few hours of the search were uneventful. We combed through dense underbrush, calling out and listening for any response. The forest was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of wildlife. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. As we pushed deeper into the wilderness, the landscape began to change subtly. The trees seemed older, more gnarled, their branches reaching out like crooked fingers. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around our ankles as we walked. I've been in these woods countless times, but something felt different, almost alive. It was late afternoon when we found the first clue. A tattered backpack hung from a low branch, its contents strewn across the forest floor. As I approached to examine it, I noticed something strange. The items, a water bottle, a map, some energy bars, all looked brand new, untouched by the elements, but the backpack itself was weathered and rotted, as if it had been out here for years. "That's impossible," my partner, Mike, muttered as he crouched down beside me. "The hiker only went missing yesterday." Before I could respond, a scream pierced the air. It was close, just beyond the next ridge. We took off running, our hearts pounding in unison with our footfalls. As we crested the hill, we stopped short, stunned by what we saw. In a small clearing stood a group of people, but they weren't our missing hiker. There were at least a dozen of them, men and women of various ages. all looking lost and terrified. Some were dressed in modern hiking gear, while others wore clothes that looked decades out of date. "Oh, thank God," one woman cried out when she saw us. "We've been lost for so long. Can you help us get out of here?" I approached cautiously, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. "When did you all get lost?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. The answers that came back chilled me to the bone. Some said they'd been wandering for hours, others for days. But one man, dressed in what looked like 1970s camping attire, insisted he'd been lost in these woods for over 40 years. As I radioed for backup, trying to explain the inexplicable situation we'd stumbled upon, Mike pulled me aside. "Alex," he whispered, his face pale, "look at their feet." I glanced down and felt my blood run cold. Despite their varied stories of how long they'd been lost, every single person in the clearing was barefoot, and their feet, they were pristine. No cuts, no dirt, no signs of having walked through this rugged terrain at all. Before I could process this new impossibility, a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and the trees around the clearing started to sway, despite there being no wind. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, gesturing for everyone to follow us. But as we turned to leave, we found our path blocked. The forest had shifted. Where there had been an open trail moments before, there was now a wall of ancient, gnarled trees. Panic set in among the group. People started running in all directions, their screams echoing through the suddenly too quiet forest. Mike and I tried to maintain order, but it was like herding cats. In the chaos, I lost sight of my partner. "Mike," I called out, my voice hoarse with fear. "Where are you?" That's when I heard it. A voice, coming from deeper in the forest. It sounded like Mike, but wrong, distorted, as if coming from underwater or very far away. "Alex, help me. I'm lost." It was the same message we'd heard on the radio that morning. With dawning horror, I realized we hadn't been sent here to rescue a lost hiker. We'd been lured into a trap. The forest around me seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Trees creaked and groaned, their branches reaching out like claws. The mist thickened, obscuring my vision until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears. I had no idea which direction would lead me out of this nightmare, but I knew I couldn't stay still. As I crashed through the underbrush, I caught glimpses of the others. Some were running like me, while others stood frozen in terror, their eyes wide and unseeing. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I ran for what felt like hours, the landscape around me shifting and changing in impossible ways. One moment I was in dense forest, the next in a misty bog, then scrambling over rocky terrain that shouldn't exist in this part of the world. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, when my legs were about to give out from exhaustion, I broke through a line of trees and found myself back at our base camp. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. The rest of our search and rescue team was there, looking at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. According to them, Mike and I had only been gone for an hour. They'd been about to send out another team to look for us. "Where's Mike?" someone asked. "And did you find the lost hiker?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? Who would believe me? In the days that followed, as search parties combed the area where Mike and I had gone, finding no trace of him or the group in the clearing, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The official report labeled it a tragic accident, assuming Mike had fallen into a ravine or succumbed to the elements. But I knew the truth. Something ancient and malevolent lurked in those woods, something that defied our understanding of reality. It had taken Mike just as it had taken countless others over the years, and it had nearly taken me. I left the search and rescue team after that, unable to set foot in the forest without being overwhelmed by panic. But the nightmares persisted. In my dreams, I hear them, Mike, the lost hikers, and countless others, calling out for help, forever wandering in a forest that never ends, Sometimes, on quiet nights, I think I can hear their voices on the wind, calling out to me, inviting me back, and a small, terrified part of me wants to answer, to return to those woods and solve the mystery once and for all. But I resist, because I know now that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some places are not meant for humans to tread, and in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, there are things that hunger for the lost and unprepared. So if you're ever hiking in the Cascades and you hear a call for help on the wind, turn back. Don't follow the voice, no matter how familiar it sounds. Because in those ancient woods, not everything that calls out is human, and not everyone who enters comes back out. The attic door creaked open, revealing a musty darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. As a real estate agent, I'd explored countless old houses, but something about this one made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Little did I know, stepping into that attic would plunge me into a nightmare that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality. My name's Emma, and I've been selling houses in this sleepy New England town for over a decade. The Blackwood Manor was supposed to be just another listing, albeit a prestigious one. The sprawling Victorian mansion had been vacant for years, its once grand facade now weathered and foreboding. But with the housing market booming, I was confident I could find a buyer who'd see past the peeling paint and overgrown gardens. I arrived early that morning, armed with my camera and a stack of disclosure forms, the key stuck in the lock, reluctant to turn, as if the house itself was resisting my intrusion. When I finally got the door open, I was hit by a wave of stale air and the unmistakable scent of decay. Nothing a good cleaning crew can't fix, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that settled over me like a shroud. The interior was a time capsule, frozen somewhere in the mid-20th century. Dust-covered furniture, yellowed lace curtains, and faded photographs adorned the rooms. As I made my way through the house, taking photos and notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was in the study that I first noticed something truly odd. A large portrait hung over the fireplace, depicting a stern-looking man in Victorian-era clothing. What caught my eye was a small detail in the background, a clock on the mantel, its hands pointing to 3:47. As I raised my camera to take a photo, I glanced at my watch. It was 3:46 p.m. The second hand on my watch ticked forward, and at that exact moment, I heard the distinct chime of a clock from somewhere in the house. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the sound had come from upstairs. Curiosity overrode my apprehension, and I found myself climbing the grand staircase, following the echo of that phantom chime. The upper floor was a maze of corridors and closed doors. As I walked, I could have sworn I heard whispers, snippets of conversation just on the edge of hearing. At the end of the hallway, I found a narrow staircase leading up to the attic. The door at the top was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I heard what sounded like a child's laughter drifting down from above. That's when I opened the door, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the gloom. The attic was cavernous, filled with shapes draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. Dust motes danced in the air, sparkling in the thin shafts of light that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a resounding bang. I whirled around, my heart pounding, but the handle wouldn't budge. Trapped, I turned back to face the attic, and that's when I saw her. A little girl, no more than 8 or 9, stood among the shrouded furniture. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her long hair tied back with a ribbon. But it was her eyes that froze me in place. They were completely black, like empty voids in her pale face. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the cramped space. "This is our home. You need to leave." I tried to speak, to ask who she was or what she meant, but no words would come. The girl tilted her head, studying me with those impossible eyes. "You're different from the others," she mused. "You can see us. That means you have to choose." Before I could question what she meant, the attic transformed around me. The dust and cobwebs vanished, replaced by vibrant wallpaper and polished furniture. Sunlight streamed through now pristine windows, and I could hear the bustle of activity from the floors below. The girl smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Welcome to our world, Emma. You have until sunset to decide if you want to stay. But be careful. Time moves differently here, and not everything is as it seems." With that cryptic warning, she vanished, leaving me alone in this impossible version of the attic. Shaken, but determined to understand what was happening, I made my way back downstairs. The house I entered was alive with activity. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses milled about, engaged in lively conversation. A gramophone played jazzy tunes, and the air was thick with cigar smoke and perfume. It was like stepping into a scene from the 1920s. As I moved through the crowd, I realized with growing horror that I could see through some of the people, as if they were only partially there. Others seemed solid, but their eyes were just like the little girl's, bottomless and dark. I tried to speak to them, to ask what was going on, but they either ignored me completely or gave me pitying looks before turning away. It was as if I was a ghost in this strange, vibrant world. As I wandered the house, I began to notice subtle wrongness everywhere. Clocks that ran backward, mirrors that showed empty rooms, doors that led to impossible places. In one room, I saw a group of people frozen in mid-conversation, like mannequins in a disturbing tableau. Time seemed to fluctuate wildly. One moment, sunlight would be streaming through the windows. The next, it would be the dead of night, stars wheeling impossibly fast across the sky outside. Throughout it all, I kept catching glimpses of the little girl. She would appear at the end of hallways or reflected in mirrors, always watching me with those unsettling black eyes. As the day, or was it days, wore on, I began to piece together the horrifying truth. The Blackwood Manor existed in some kind of limbo, trapped between worlds. The people I saw were souls caught in this in-between place, reliving moments from the house's long history. Some, like the little girl, seemed aware of their situation. Others were oblivious, endlessly repeating the same actions and conversations. And now, for reasons I couldn't fathom, I had been drawn into this nightmare realm. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I found myself back in the study with the portrait. The clock on the mantel now read 5:47, and I knew instinctively that sunset was approaching. I had to make my choice. The little girl appeared beside me, her expression solemn. "Time's almost up, Emma. Will you stay with us, become part of the house's history? Or will you try to leave knowing what you now know?" I looked at her, this child who was so much more than she appeared. "What happens if I stay?" I asked, my voice hoarse from disuse. She smiled, and for a moment I saw the lonely little girl behind the ageless being. "You'll never be alone again. You'll be part of something eternal, but you'll also never truly live again, frozen in time, just like the rest of us." "And if I leave?" Her smile faded. "You return to your world, but changed. The knowledge of what exists beyond the veil will always be with you. And the house will call to you, always." I closed my eyes, weighing my options. The promise of eternity, of never being alone, was tempting. But the thought of being trapped in this beautiful, terrifying unreality forever was unbearable. "I want to leave," I said finally, opening my eyes to meet her dark gaze. She nodded, unsurprised. "Very well. But remember, Emma, once you've seen beyond the veil, you can never truly unsee it. The door will always be open for you, should you change your mind." With those words, the world around me began to dissolve. The vibrant colors faded, the sounds of the party dimmed, and I felt myself falling. I gasped awake, finding myself sprawled on the dusty attic floor. Sunlight streamed through the grimy windows. and my watch read 5:50 p.m. Only 2 hours had passed in the real world. On shaky legs, I made my way out of the house, not stopping until I was in my car, the engine running and the Blackwood Manor receding in my rearview mirror. I knew I should call my office, explain why I hadn't returned with the listing photos and paperwork. But how could I possibly explain what had happened? In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a vivid hallucination, perhaps brought on by some toxic mold in that old house. But deep down, I knew the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear distant music and laughter on the wind. And in my dreams, a little girl with eyes like bottomless pits watches me, waiting, always waiting. I haven't been back to Blackwood Manor. I'm not sure I ever will. But I know the door is still open, and a part of me wonders what would happen if I stepped through once more. So if you're ever house hunting and come across a grand old Victorian that seems too good to be true, be careful. Some houses have secrets that are better left undiscovered, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again.